No one noticed the lonely widow's cooking until a cowboy took one bite and refused to walk away. Hook open on this, he didn't even look at her face. Orson Vale walked the length of the Copper Ridge Harvest Fair that morning, like a man who owned the ground beneath every boot heel, because in most ways, he did. And when he passed the table at the far end of the row, the one with the mismatched cloth, and the widow standing quietly, behind 3 dozen perfectly made rolls, he stopped. Not to buy, not to taste. He stopped, looked at her bread, looked at her, and then said loudly enough for the people nearby to hear still at it, "Are you?" Some women never learn when they've already lost. Then he walked away laughing, and Beatrice Hollowell stood there and did not cry. Not because she wasn't hurt, but because she had used up every tear she had 3 years ago, and there were none left for a man like him. If that had been you, standing there in the summer heat with your best work laid out on a table no one was stopping at, and the man who ruined your life walked past and laughed, what would you have done? That moment is where this story begins. And I promise you, it does not end where you think it will. Before we go further, if you're new here, please subscribe and follow along. This story runs 5 parts, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that table. The summer of 1889 came to Copper Ridge like a punishment. The heat arrived in June and never left. By August, the creek that ran behind the grain mill had dropped so low that children could cross it without getting their knees wet. The dust that rose off the main road coated everything: windows, laundry, the faces of men who worked outdoors, the tablecloths set up each year at the harvest fair. Beatrice Hollowell had been awake since 3 in the morning. She had not slept well, which was not unusual. She had not slept well in 3 years. But that particular morning she rose in the dark of her small rented room above the feed store and lit the single lamp on the table and began to work, because work was the only thing she trusted anymore. The bread dough she had set the night before had risen beautifully more than she expected, which gave her a small, private satisfaction she would not have admitted to anyone. Punched it down, shaped the loaves, covered them, and started on the cinnamon rolls while the oven warmed. Her hands remembered everything even when her mind was elsewhere. She had learned to bake at her mother's elbow at the age of 7, and she had spent the next 28 years doing it with the kind of quiet seriousness that some people spend on prayer. Her late husband, Thomas, used to say that watching Beatrice work in a kitchen was like watching a carpenter who had forgotten that other carpenters existed. She was simply the best at what she did, and she knew it without needing to announce it. Thomas had been gone 4 years now, 3 since the bakery. She did not think about those 2 facts together very often. They sat beside each other in her memory like 2 stones on a fence rail, heavy and permanent, and she had learned to walk past them without looking. By 5:30, she had loaded the wagon. 12 loaves of bread, 3 dozen cinnamon rolls, 4 fruit pies, 2 apple, 1 cherry, 1 peach, and a flat of smaller rolls she had glazed with honey the night before and wrapped individually in brown paper because she had noticed, at previous markets, that people liked being able to pick something up and carry it without making a decision about slicing. That attention to small things had once made her bakery the most talked about business in Copper Ridge. It had also made Orson Vale notice her. She did not let herself think about that on the drive to the fairgrounds. She thought instead about the road, about the left wheel on her wagon that had been wobbling since April, about whether the peach pie had set properly, about the table placement she planned to request from the fair organizer, something near the entrance if possible, something visible. What she got was the end of the row. The fair organizer, a thin, nervous man named Purcell, who always seemed to be waiting for something terrible to happen, had given her the last table on the south side of the grounds, backed against the fence that separated the market stalls from the livestock area. The smell from the cattle pens drifted that direction when the wind shifted. Purcell had not apologized when he showed her to it. He had simply pointed and walked away, and Beatrice had set her jaw and unloaded her wagon without saying a single word about it. By 8 in the morning, she was ready. By 9, 2 women had approached the table, looked at the bread, and kept walking. Were dark. One of them said something to the other as they went, too quietly to hear, but the glance that accompanied it was not difficult to interpret. By 10, she had sold 4 honey rolls and one small loaf to an elderly man who paid without looking at her, tucked the bread under his arm, and moved on. She stood behind the table and kept her expression neutral. She had practiced this. The neutral expression was a kind of armor she had built for herself over 3 years, not cold exactly, but contained. Still, it kept people from seeing things she did not want them to see. What she did not practice was what to do when Orson Vale came walking down the row. She saw him from 40 feet away, and her stomach dropped like a stone into cold water. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal one with a silver watch chain, and he was accompanied by 2 men she recognized as county officials. He was laughing at something one of them had said. He moved with the particular ease of a person who has never once doubted that a room, or in this case a fairground, belonged to him. He had not spoken to her directly since the day 3 years ago, when he had stood outside the ruin of her bakery, and told her pleasantly that he hoped she had learned something. She had learned several things. None of them were what he intended. He reached her table and stopped, and the 2 officials stopped with him. She watched his eyes move across the bread and the pies and the rolls with the flat, assessing look of a man calculating inventory he intended to destroy. Then he looked at her. "Still at it, are you?" he said. His voice was not loud, but it was designed to carry. Some women never learn when they've already lost. One of the county officials made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The other one looked mildly uncomfortable and studied his boots. Beatrice said nothing. She kept her expression exactly where it was. She did not move her hands, did not shift her weight, did not look away from Vale's face. She simply waited, with the particular stillness of someone who has already survived the worst this man can do and is no longer afraid of his warm-up material. Vale waited a moment, perhaps expecting her to respond, perhaps expecting her to crumble. When neither happened, something flickered briefly across his face, not quite annoyance, but close to it, and he turned and walked on, resuming his conversation with the officials as if she were a fence post he had passed. The morning continued. Beatrice breathed carefully and evenly, and reminded herself that breathing was enough, that standing was enough, that being here at all was a form of defiance that he would not receive the satisfaction of witnessing her abandon. The customers still did not come. Families walked past. A group of women her own age slowed near her table, and for a moment Beatrice thought, but then one of them said, just loud enough, "Isn't that the woman whose bakery closed?" And they moved on. A young couple stopped to look at the peach pie, spent nearly 2 minutes examining it closely, and then bought a pie from the table 2 spots down without glancing back. By 11 o'clock, Beatrice had earned $1.40. Her ingredients had cost nearly $4. She did not move from behind the table. Most of its windows were dark. She straightened the rolls that didn't need straightening, and adjusted the cloth that didn't need adjusting, and told herself what she always told herself. You have been through worse. You have been through this. You are still here. It helped less than it used to. She was allowing herself the private admission that she might pack up early, for the first time in 3 years. The thought of simply leaving was stronger than the stubbornness that usually defeated it when she heard boots for Beatrice, a particular deliberate sound, and looked up. The man who had stopped at her table was not what she expected. He was tall, not in the way that draws attention in a crowd, but in the way that becomes apparent when someone is standing 3 feet in front of you and you have to adjust your gaze upward slightly. He was broad across the shoulders in the manner of a man who has spent decades doing physical work rather than performing it. His face was weathered in a way that aged him. She guessed early 40s, and he had dark eyes that moved across her display with a focused attention that was different from the calculating look Vale had given it an hour before. This was the look of a man who was actually hungry. Cinnamon said. Not a question exactly. How much? 10 cents, Beatrice said. He reached into his vest pocket, produced a dime, set it on the table, and picked up one of the rolls. He did not move away. He stood at her table and ate it right there, without ceremony, and Beatrice watched him because she could not help it, because she had been baking for 28 years. And the moment when someone ate her food for the first time still mattered to her, even when she pretended it didn't. He finished the roll. He looked at the table. Then he looked at her. "Who taught you to make these?" he said. It was such a specific question, and so unexpected, that it cracked something open in her chest before she could stop it. Not the question itself, but what it implied that the roll was good enough to have a story behind it, that the person eating it was curious about that story, that her work was not just product, but something worth asking about. My mother, she said, and then 30 years of practice. He's nodded slowly. My name is Silas Braddock. I run the cattle operation about 12 miles north, Braddock Ranch. He paused. I'm going to be honest with you. That is the finest thing I have eaten at one of these fairs in as long as I can remember. And I've been coming to this fair for 21 years. Beatrice looked at him steadily. She had learned to be cautious with compliments. Compliments from strangers had preceded some of the worst moments of her life. Thank you, she said carefully. Silas Braddock looked at the table again. Then he looked around the fairgrounds with an expression she could not immediately read, taking something in, measuring something, and then he looked back at her. How much for all of it, he said. She blinked. I'm sorry? Everything on the table, he said. How much for all of it? Now she stared at him outright, because the question made no sense. You can't possibly, that's 12 loaves of bread, 3 dozen rolls, and 4 pies. She calculated quickly, that's $4.60 worth of product. $4.60. Then he said, and reached into his jacket pocket. Several things happened simultaneously. Beatrice's brain issued several urgent competing instructions, none of which she followed. A couple from the table 2 spots down had turned to stare. The nervous fair organizer, Purcell, had appeared from somewhere nearby and was watching with his mouth slightly open. And Tuzen, stopping, had reversed direction and were drifting back toward her end of the row, with a particular speed, who noticed that someone else wants something they ignored. Silas Braddock set $5 on the table. Keep the change, he said, not as a grand gesture, but the way someone says keep the change when they mean it practically and aren't interested in making a performance of it. He began gathering pies carefully, setting them in the crook of his arm, with more competence most men handled such things. Beatrice stared at the $5 bill on the table for a moment, a full week's groceries money, sitting there in the summer heat, and then she did what she had trained herself to do in difficult moments. She moved. She found a spare crate beneath the table and helped him pack the bread. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that. I need to ask you something, Silas said while she was wrapping the last of the loaves, and I want you to take it as a genuine question, not as a man who thinks he's doing you a favor. She straightened and looked at him. I have 12 men working my ranch, he said, and they have been eating terrible food since my last cook left in March. I have tried to solve that problem 3 times and failed all 3 times. And the problem isn't the money I'm paying, it's that I cannot find a person who actually knows what they're doing in a kitchen. He paused. You clearly know what you're doing in a kitchen. I'm offering you full control of mine. Your own hours within reason, your own menu within budget, a private room above the stable, and wages I'm prepared to negotiate right now if you're interested. The woman from the table 2 spots down had drifted close enough that she was pretending to examine Beatrice's empty table, and Beatrice could see 2 other people at the edge of her peripheral vision, watching with undisguised curiosity. She was aware of all of this. She was also aware that her heart was doing something complicated that she hadn't given it permission to do. I don't know you, she said. That's true, Silas said. You don't. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to consider a business arrangement. You can ask anyone in this county about my operation and my reputation, and you can take as long as you need before you give me an answer. Why me? She said. There are other cooks, other women who need work. Something shifted in his expression. It was not pity. She was familiar with pity and had developed a strong sensitivity to it, and this was not it. It was something closer to recognition. Because I watched you stand behind this table for 2 hours, he said quietly, and I watched a man say something to you was meant to make you pack up and leave, and you are still here. That tells me something about how you handle a hard day. And on a cattle ranch, there are a considerable number of hard days. The fair noise continued around them, children, animals, voices, the creak of a wagon somewhere behind the stalls. Beatrice stood in the middle of all of it and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the specific and terrifying sensation of a door opening. She had not planned on any doors. She had planned on packing up early and going home and eating a bowl of oatmeal alone in her room above the feed store and doing the same thing next week. And the week after that, surviving with her head down and her expectations low and nothing left to lose. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "Of course," Silas said. He picked up his crate and tucked the last pie under his arm. "My foreman Chester will be at the grain mill on Thursday. He can answer any questions you have, or you can send word with him if you've decided." He paused. "I hope you will." Then he walked away through the crowd and people stepped aside for him without quite realizing they were doing it, and Beatrice stood at her empty table and watched him go. The $5 bill was still under her hand. She looked down at it. Then she looked up at the end of the row, at the fairgrounds that had ignored her all morning, at the spot where Vale had stood and laughed, at the people, now watching her with open curiosity, of a crowd that has just witnessed something they don't fully understand but sense is important. She folded the bill and put it in her pocket. Then she began carefully packing up the empty crates, and she thought about what he had said. "I'm not asking you to trust me," and she turned the words over in her mind the way she turned bread dough, looking for what was underneath. She had trusted people before. She had trusted her husband, and he had died. She had trusted her community, and they had believed the lies of a man with more money than conscience. She had trusted the idea that if you worked honestly and well, the world would eventually let you do that in peace. That last one had been the most expensive lesson. The most expensive. She loaded the final crate onto her wagon and climbed to the seat and took the reins and sat there a moment before clicking the horse forward, looking at the empty table at the end of the row. 12 miles north, a man with dark eyes and dusty boots was loading her bread into whatever passed for a kitchen on a cattle ranch, and she was 35 years old, and she had nothing left to protect by playing it safe. She did not make a decision in that moment. She told herself she would think about it until Thursday. She was lying. She had already decided. She just needed 2 weeks to admit it to herself, to the rented room above the feed store, to the ghost of the bakery that Vale had taken from her, and most importantly, to the quiet and very dangerous hope that had risen in her chest the moment a stranger stopped at her table and asked who had taught her to make cinnamon rolls. Her mother, and 30 years of practice, and something somewhere inside her that had apparently not finished yet. The road north was longer than 12 miles felt on a map. Beatrice had made the drive twice before Thursday, once to deliver Chester Purcell's answer, which was simply that she would come, and once more on the actual morning of her arrival, 2 weeks after the fair, everything she owned, loaded into the back of the wagon she had borrowed from her landlord, in exchange for 3 loaves of bread and a promise to return it by Sunday. She had not told many people she was leaving. There was no one in Copper Ridge who required a long explanation, and the few who might have wanted one were precisely the people she did not feel she owed it to. Mrs. Dowd from the fabric shop had caught her loading boxes on Thursday morning and stood on the sidewalk with her arms folded, and her expression carrying the particular weight of a woman who considers herself a guardian of community standards. "You're actually going," Mrs. Dowd said. It was not a question. "I am," Beatrice said, and kept loading. 12 miles north, living on a cattle ranch, cooking for men you don't know, Mrs. Dowd said it in the tone of someone reading a list of crimes. "People are going to talk, Beatrice." Beatrice set a crate in the wagon and turned around. "People have been talking about me for 3 years, Margaret. It hasn't changed much." Mrs. Dowd's mouth tightened. "It's not proper." "Neither is going hungry," Beatrice said. "But I managed that for a while, too." She climbed onto the wagon seat and took the reins and did not look back at Mrs. Dowd's expression, though she could feel it on the back of her neck for the first quarter mile. The ranch appeared on the horizon before she expected it, a cluster of buildings that grew from the flat, dry land with the unbeautiful practicality of everything built to work rather than impress. A main house, 2 long bunkhouses, a stable, 3 outbuildings, and a structure she eventually identified as the cook shed attached by a short covered walk to the back of the main house. Fencing ran in every direction she looked. Beyond the fencing, cattle. Beyond the cattle, more land than she could see the end of. Chester met her at the gate. He was a compact, weathered man in his 50s, with a gray mustache and the kind of permanent squint that came from decades of reading weather. He nodded at her once, took the horse's bridle without being asked, and said, "We're glad you came," in a tone that suggested he was constitutionally incapable of saying anything with more enthusiasm than that. Silas Braddock was not at the gate. She noticed this and told herself it didn't matter, and believed herself approximately halfway. She was shown to the cook shed first. Chester opened the door and stepped back without commentary, and Beatrice walked in and stood still for a full 10 seconds. She had expected rough. She had not expected this rough. The iron range in the corner was so coated in grease that it had developed its own geography. The shelving along the back held a collection of pots and pans that had been to have been gathered from several different sources, and none of them matched. Aworst of its windows, a work table in the center of the room had a split running down the middle that someone had attempted to fill with what looked like pine pitch and prayer. The floor was swept. At least Chester had clearly made some effort. But the walls were stained smokes, and the window above the dry sink was cracked along one corner and covered on the outside with a piece of burlap that someone had tacked up, perhaps optimistically, as a curtain. She turned and looked at Chester. "How long has it been like this?" she said. Chester's expression did not change. "Like what?" "Like something I need to spend 3 days cleaning before I can cook a single meal in it." He considered this. "About 6 years," he said. "Our last cook before March didn't mind it." "Your last cook before March," Beatrice said, "was presumably not being asked to feed 12 men every day." 14, counting Silas and myself. She looked at the range again. She walked to it and pressed one finger to the surface and looked at what came off on her finger and decided some things were better not examined too closely. She looked at the work table, the split running down it, the pine pitch, all of it. "I need lye soap," she said, "a full bucket of it. A wire brush, 2 rags, and someone who is willing to work for 2 hours without asking me why." Chester almost smiled. It was hard to tell with the mustache. "I'll get you young Pete." Young Pete turned out to be 19 years old, narrow as a fence rail, and possessed of the particular gift of following exact instructions without adding opinions. He appeared at the cook shed door 20 minutes later with lye soap and a brush and 2 rags over his shoulder. And Beatrice set him to work on the range while she started on the shelf, and they did not speak much except functionally, which was exactly what she needed. By the end of the first day, she had a range she was willing to use and a work table that was still split but scrubbed to clean wood, and she had made a list of everything the kitchen was missing, which was substantial, and a separate list of what she could work with in the meantime, which was less substantial but workable. She made biscuits for dinner that first night. Simple biscuits, because she didn't yet know the range's temperament. Every range had one. The hot spots, the cool corners, the particular way it ran when the fire was new versus when it had been burning for an hour, and she needed to learn it before she trusted it with anything she cared about. She made the biscuits, and a pot of beans she had found in a sack near the door that looked like they'd been purchased several months ago, and she browned some salt pork she'd discovered in a crock near the window. The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse dining room at a long table that seated all of them at once. Chester had told her they typically came in at 6. At 5:45, Beatrice carried the first pot over, and at 5:49 she was standing near the door, watching 14 men file in and sit down. They were quiet in the way that men who have learned not to expect much from a meal are quiet, resigned. Mostly, some of them still dusty from the day's work, 3 of them clearly exhausted enough that they were operating primarily on habit. One of them, a heavy-set man near the far end she would later learn was called. Hank looked at the biscuits with an expression that did not suggest optimism. Then he ate one. He put the whole thing in his mouth and chewed, and the expression changed. Not dramatically. Cowboys she had already gathered did not do things dramatically unless there was livestock involved. But the resignation shifted into something else, and he reached for a second biscuit before he had finished swallowing the first. Conscious besets. And something about that small, greedy, unself-conscious gesture told Beatrice everything she needed to know about how long these men had been eating badly. No one said much that first night. But when she came back to collect the pots, they were empty. Every single one. She stood in the bunkhouse kitchen, holding an empty pot, and felt something move through her that she didn't try to name. It was too close to the surface, too much. She set the pot down, picked up another, and went back to the cook shed. The next morning, she was up at 4. She had learned early in her baking life that the first hour before sunrise was the best hour of any day. The one where the world not yet started asking things of you, where you could simply work in the silence and let the work be what it was. She started bread dough and set coffee on and began planning the week's menu with what she had available, and by the time pale light was coming through the cracked window, she had a reasonable outline and warm hands and the particular quiet satisfaction of a person who knows what they are doing and is being allowed to do it. Silas found her there at 6:15. She heard his boots on the covered walk and knew from the weight of them that it wasn't Chester or young Pete, and she was not surprised when he appeared in the doorway. He was already dressed for the day, hat in hand, and he looked at the kitchen, the cleaned range, the organized shelves, the dough rising under cloth on the work table, with an expression that was careful not to be surprised. "Bread," he said. "It needs another hour," she said. "Coffee's ready." He came in and poured himself a cup from the pot on the back of the range and stood against the wall, the way a man stands in a kitchen that is not his, which is to say carefully, with awareness of where his elbows are. He drank the coffee and looked at the room, and she kept working, and neither of them spoke for a moment that was not comfortable, but was not uncomfortable either. It was the silence of two people figuring out the shape of a new arrangement. "Chester says you gave Pete a 2-hour education in lye soap yesterday," Silas said. "Your range was a health concern," she said. "He also says the men ate everything." "Yes." "That hasn't happened in a while," Silas said. He said it simply, without performance, and she recognized the honesty in it and decided to answer it in kind. "They were hungry for something real," she said. "Not just food. People can tell when someone made something with care. Even cowboys." Silas looked at his coffee cup. "Even cowboys," he said, with something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. "I need things," she said. "I made a list." She picked it up from the shelf and handed it to him. He looked at it. His expression moved through several small adjustments. "This is a long list. Your kitchen was missing more than I expected. Some of these things," he started, "are necessary," she said, "if you want what you hired me for." He looked at the list again. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll take it to town Thursday." "Thank you." He finished his coffee and rinsed the cup at the dry sink. She noted this, the small, unconscious courtesy of a man who lived with other people and had thought about it and picked up his hat. "One more thing," she said before he reached the door. He turned. "The men," she said, "some of them are going to test me. They already started last night. I want you to know that I'll handle it myself. I'm not asking you to intervene, and I would prefer that you don't unless someone behaves in a way that crosses a line you and I can agree on in advance. Can we agree on that?" He studied her face for a moment. "What's the line?" he said. "If someone is disrespectful to my face and continues after I've dressed it once, I'll tell Chester. And I'd expect that to be handled. Everything short of that is mine to manage." Silas nodded. "Agreed," he said, "though I'll say you might be surprised." "At what?" "How fast they come around," he said, "when someone feeds them like people instead of livestock." He left, and she stood in the kitchen and listened to his boots cross the covered walk and disappear. And then its windows were dark, and then she turned back to her bread and did not think about what he had just said for approximately 4 minutes before she gave up and thought about it anyway. The testing began on the 3rd day. It was Hank, which she had predicted. Hank was the kind of man who establishes the terms of a social arrangement early and loudly, and she had been watching him since that first biscuit, watching how the other men oriented toward him, how he sat, what he said and didn't say, the way he occupied space. He was not malicious. He was, she suspected, not entirely stupid. He was simply a man who had never been in a kitchen run by a woman and had formed no particular opinion about it yet, which meant the opinion was still forming, and her best opportunity was right now. He arrived at the cook shed door on the 3rd morning while she was making breakfast, and leaned against the frame with his arms crossed and said, "I like my eggs cooked hard, not soft. I want you to know that before you serve me something wrong again." She didn't turn around. She finished the sentence. She was in the middle of turning bacon on the iron griddle before she said, "I served you what I served everyone, because I don't yet know everyone's preferences. I'm learning them. If you tell me what you like, I'll do my best to accommodate it. If you come to my kitchen door before breakfast to complain about eggs you haven't tasted yet, I'll ask you to come back. When breakfast is ready, and tell me then." Silence from the doorway. "Hard eggs," she continued evenly. "Noted." Another silence. Then the sound of boots retreating from the door. Young Pete, who was washing yesterday's pots in the corner and had witnessed the entire exchange with the careful stillness of a prairie dog near a hawk, let out a slow breath. "He's never backed down from anything that fast," Pete said with what she recognized as genuine awe. "He didn't back down," she said. "He just decided to wait and see. That's different. Make sure you're washing inside the handle on those, not just around it." "Yes, ma'am." The week moved with the particular speed of hard work, which is to say it moved both slowly and fast, depending on which direction she was looking. The mornings were hers, 4 o'clock wake, the kitchen lit by lamplight, the specific quiet satisfaction of working alone in a space that was beginning to feel, cautiously, like hers. She rearranged the shelving twice before she found a system that worked. She negotiated with the range's unpredictable hotspots until she understood them well enough to plan around them. She made bread every other day and biscuits on the alternating days, and she started a sourdough culture in a crock she found under the work table, feeding it each morning with flour and water and patience. The afternoons were harder. She spent them on the logistics of cooking for 14 men 3 times a day, with a budget that was adequate but not generous, which meant she had to plan carefully, waste nothing, and make inexpensive cuts of meat taste like something worth eating. She learned the ranch's supply schedule and its habits and the particular preferences of individual men. Pete liked sweet things, which she filed away. A quiet older cowhand named Reuben ate very little at breakfast but needed a large meal at noon. 2 of the younger men would eat anything placed in front of them with equal enthusiasm and could be relied upon as a control group. By the end of the second week, things had shifted. She was not sure exactly when it happened. Only that one morning she walked into the bunkhouse dining room with the breakfast pots, and there was a different quality to the room. The men were still dusty, still tired, still fundamentally cowboys whose emotional range did not include anything she would have called expressive. But they had started saving her the seat nearest the stove so she could sit down, if she had a moment, which she rarely did, but the fact of its being saved registered somewhere in her chest and stayed there. Hank, specifically, had made a kind of peace with her. It had happened over a pot of beef stew. She had been cooking it most of the day, a cheap cut from the far end of the supply order, the kind of meat that needs hours of low heat and persuasion before it becomes something worth eating. And she had added dried herbs and 2 onions and a handful of the late-season root vegetables Chester had brought back from town, and when she tasted it at 4 in the afternoon, she knew it was good. Not just adequate, actually good. Hank had been given seconds that night by the simple physics of being seated closest to the pot. He ate the second bowl without speaking, and when he was done, he set down his spoon and said, to no one in particular, "My mother used to make something like this." He said it quietly, almost to himself, not as a compliment directed at Beatrice, but as a surfaced in him unexpectedly and found its way out before he could stop it. Nobody responded, because cowboys. But Beatrice heard it, and she understood that Hank had just told her something important about why food mattered and what it could carry besides nutrition, and she tucked it away beside young Pete's fondness for sweet things and Reuben's noon appetite and all the other small facts she was collecting about the people she fed every day. Because that was the thing about cooking, the real thing, the thing she had known since she was 7 years old at her mother's elbow and had never once stopped believing, even when Orson Vale and his machinery had tried to take it from her. Feeding people was not just making food. It was paying attention to who they were and what they needed and what they might not know how to ask for, and then making something that answered those questions without requiring them to have asked. It was the most intimate thing you could do for a stranger, and the men at Braddock Ranch were slowly becoming something closer to known. Travelers began arriving in the 4th week. She didn't know how word had spread, exactly. Chester said something about the hands mentioning the food at the grain mill in town, and someone at the grain mill had mentioned it to someone passing through, and the someone passing through had stopped at the ranch on his way north and asked if he could buy a meal, and Silas had said yes, and charged him 15 cents for it, and the traveler had eaten and apparently told the next person he encountered something sufficiently enthusiastic to produce a second traveler 4 days later, and then a third. By the 5th week, they were getting 2 or 3 travelers a day. Silas brought her the first extra dollar on a Friday evening. He knocked on the cook shed door he had started knocking, rather than appearing in the doorway, sometime in the second week, and she had noticed, and when she opened it, he was holding a small envelope. "From the travelers this week," he said. "After covering the extra food costs, this is what's left. I want you to have it." She looked at the envelope. "That's your revenue," she said. "I was already paid for the cooking." "You cooked extra," he said, "and it's bringing people to the ranch who aren't here for the cattle. That's a different thing. Take it." She took the envelope. Inside was $2.40. She stood in the doorway holding it and looked at Silas Braddock's face, which was doing that thing it sometimes did, where it showed something and then moved quickly past it. "This is happening because you're good," he said. "I want you to know that I see that." She had spent 3 years in a town that had chosen not to see it. The sentence did something to her that she did not entirely know how to handle, and she covered the handling of it by looking at the envelope instead of at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left, stood in the doorway, until she could not hear his boots anymore, and then she went inside and looked at the $2.40 in the little envelope, and thought about what it meant. It meant that what she built here was hers, not charity, not rescue. Hers, her skill, her attention, her 30 years of practice in her mother's hands, and all the early mornings, and the hard months after Thomas, and the wreckage of the bakery, and the end of the row at the harvest fair, all of it accumulated into this $2.40 from strangers who had gone out of their way to eat her food. She set the envelope on the shelf next to the sourdough crock and went back to work. She was in the middle of planning the following week's menu when the thought arrived, quiet and certain, the way the worst thoughts always do, not crashing in, but simply appearing as if they had been waiting for a moment when her guard was occupied elsewhere. Orson Vale was going to hear about this. She didn't know when, and she didn't know through which particular channel, but she knew it with the certainty of someone who had studied this man's patterns for 3 years. Vale monitored Copper Ridge's commercial landscape the way a hawk monitors a field, not out of curiosity, but out of the particular territorial instinct of someone who has decided that prosperity in his county is something he should be consulted about. The bakery had grown too successful. The travelers coming to Braddock Ranch for meals were already too visible. Someone would mention it at the grain mill, and someone at the grain mill would mention it to someone who mentioned it to Vale, and then she stopped herself. She put the menu down and looked at the wall and said, out loud, to no one, 1 week at a time. She believed this approximately as much as she believed Vale wouldn't hear about the travelers, which is to say, not much. But there was supper to make, and the bread needed checking, and young Pete would arrive at the back door in 20 minutes, expecting direction, and Reuben had mentioned that morning that his back was giving him trouble, which meant she should make something that required him to lift a spoon rather than a fork. And Hank's birthday was in 4 days. She had gathered this from an offhand comment Pete had made on Tuesday, and she had been quietly considering making the thing his mother used to make. She picked up the menu and kept working. The night that changed everything else, not in the way of a single event, but in the way of a slow tide that suddenly makes itself visible, came on a Wednesday evening, 6 weeks into her time at Braddock Ranch. She had finished the supper cleanup and was sitting at the work table with a cup of coffee, and her accounts book, the small leather-covered notebook in which she tracked every purchase, every traveler payment, every expenditure, because she had learned from the bakery that the only thing between a working woman and a man who wanted to call her dishonest was a paper trail so thorough and meticulous that even his lawyers would tire of looking at it when she heard voices from the direction of the main house. Not loud, not a fight, but 2 voices with the particular quality that voices get when the conversation is serious and the speakers are trying not to be heard through walls. She heard her name. She did not move closer to the wall. She was not that kind of person. But she heard her name, and then she heard Silas's voice, low and even, and then a second voice she did not recognize, and then a phrase that arrived through the walls of the cook shed and the covered walk, and landed in the middle of her chest like a stone, dropped into still water. The county is going to have to look at it. She sat very still. She had been here 6 weeks. She had cleaned the range and learned the hands and built a sourdough culture and started turning a profit for the ranch from travelers who came out of their way for bread and stew and the simple dignity of a meal made by someone who cared about making it. And already, the machinery was starting. She recognized the sound of it. She had heard it before, 3 years ago, in a different form, from a different direction. The investigations, the complaints, the official language that wrapped a powerful man's spite in the vocabulary of procedure and law. She looked at her accounts book, at the columns of careful figures, at every purchase documented, every cent accounted for, every traveler's meal recorded with date and amount. She had known this was coming. She had known it the moment Orson Vale laughed at her table at the end of the row and said some women never learn when they've already lost. She closed the accounts book and set it on the shelf next to the sourdough crock and the envelope with the $2.40, and she sat with her coffee going cold in her hands and thought out what it meant that she was not surprised. Not surprised, and not she checked herself carefully. Honestly, not ready to run. That was new. 3 years ago, the first hint of Vale's machinery had sent her into a kind of paralysis she had taken months to understand, let alone recover from. The investigations had felt like weather vast and impersonal and impossible to argue with, because how do you argue with weather? But she understood now what she had not understood then. It wasn't weather, it was a man. One man with money and a grudge, and the patience to use both. And a man, even one with money, even one with patience, could be answered. She sat in the cook shed at Braddock Ranch, with the lamp burning low, and her cold coffee and her meticulous accounts book, and she thought about Thomas, who had believed in her and died before he could see what she became after the believing. She thought about her mother's hands over bread dough at 5 in the morning, the particular patience of that, the years and years of practice behind it. She thought about Hank's face when the stew reminded him of something he had lost. She thought about young Pete, who had turned out to be the most thorough pot washer she had ever worked with. She thought about Silas Braddock, standing in the doorway of the cook shed on the first morning and drinking his coffee carefully, aware of where his elbows were. Then she opened her accounts book again and turned to a fresh page and began, in the small, precise handwriting she used for everything that mattered, to write down everything she knew, every purchase, every traveler, every date, every payment. Not because she was afraid, because she was done being caught unprepared. Most of it dark. Whatever Vale intended to bring to Braddock Ranch, he was going to find something he had not encountered the last time. The last time, she had been alone, grieving, and caught off guard. Most of its windows were dark. The last time she had not understood what was happening until the complaints had already stacked too high to answer. This time, she had a kitchen she had cleaned herself, a reputation she had built herself, a book full of careful numbers. 14 men who came to her table 3 times a day and ate everything she put in front of them. And something else she hadn't counted on when she drove north 2 weeks after the fair with everything she owned in a borrowed wagon. She had someone who had stopped at her table when no one else did and said plainly, "That is the finest thing I have eaten in years." She did not know yet what to do with Silas Braddock. That question was in a compartment she was not ready to open, and she was disciplined enough to leave it shut for now. But she knew what he was not. He was not a man who would stand by and watch what Vale had done to her bakery happen again, to something she had built on his land. She didn't know how she knew this. She had spent 6 weeks learning a cattle ranch, learning 14 men, learning a temperamental iron range, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, she had also, without planning to, started learning Silas Braddock. And the one thing she was certain of, more certain than anything she had been certain of in 3 years, was this: whatever came through the door next, she was not going to face it from the end of the row with $1.40 and an empty table. She turned another page in the accounts book. She wrote the date at the top, and then she kept going. The voice she had heard through the wall belonged to a man named Gerald Fitch. She learned this the next morning from Chester, who told her with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that some information needed to be delivered plainly and without editorial comment. Gerald Fitch was a county compliance officer, one of 3 in the district, and he had arrived at Braddock Ranch the previous evening on the recommendation, Chester said, choosing the word with audible precision, of several Copper Ridge business owners who had filed formal concerns about the operation of an unlicensed commercial dining establishment on private ranch property. Beatrice was at the work table when Chester told her this. She was shaping bread dough, and she kept shaping it. Several business owners, she said. That's the language Fitch used, Chester said. But you know who sent him. Chester looked at the floor, then at her. I have a reasonable guess, he said. She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. How long does Silas have to respond? Fitch is coming back Thursday. Silas is talking to his lawyer today. Thursday was 4 days away. She had 4 days, which was 3 more than she had expected and 1 fewer than she needed to feel completely ready. She had been preparing for this since the night she heard the voices through the wall, filling pages in her accounts book, organizing every receipt and record into a sequence a county official could follow without assistance. But there was a difference between preparing for something and the thing arriving, and she felt that difference now in the particular way her jaw had tightened without her telling it to. Chester, she said, without stopping the work in her hands. Has Silas said anything about what he intends to do? He intends to fight it, Chester said. That's what he told Fitch last night. He said it directly, which is either brave or impractical, depending on how you look at it. Both, probably, she said. Thank you for telling me. Chester nodded and went back out, and she stood alone in the cook shed with her bread and her thoughts and the sound of cattle somewhere beyond the fence, and she let herself have approximately 2 minutes of the specific cold fear that comes from knowing a thing you have already survived is coming at you again, from a slightly different angle. Then she put the dough in the pan and covered it, and started coffee and opened her accounts book to the most recent page. She did not wait for Silas to come to her. She went to him. She found him in the small office off the main house, a room she had not been inside before, lined with ranch ledgers and a county map tacked to one wall, sitting across from a man she recognized as Jacob Holt, who had the bearing of a lawyer, in the way that certain men carry their profession in their pachar, like a tool they have been using for so long it has shaped the hand that holds it. Silas looked up when she knocked on the open door, and something shifted in his expression that she could not read quickly enough before he composed it. Beatrice. Come in. I can come back, she started. No, he said, please. This concerns you directly. Jacob, this is Beatrice Hollowell. She manages the kitchen. Jacob Holt stood old manners. She noted the kind that stick in men who grew up with them and extended his hand. Mrs. Hollowell. Silas has been telling me about your operation here. I have some questions if you're willing. She sat down. She set her accounts book on the desk between them. I came to give you this, she said. Every purchase, payment, and meal since I arrived. Every traveler, the date they came, what they paid, what it cost to feed them. I have the supply receipts organized by week in the back. Holt looked at the book. He picked it up and opened it and was quiet for a long moment, turning pages. Silas watched her, and she looked at the county map on the wall because it was easier than the alternative. This is thorough, Holt said, which she understood was lawyer language. For this is the most thorough accounting I have seen in recent memory, and I am adjusting my assessment of the situation accordingly. I've had practice keeping records, she said. Someone tried to use the absence of them against me once before. Holt set the book down. Vale, he said. She looked at him. Silas tell you that? Silas told me about your bakery, Holt said carefully. I'm asking if you believe this complaint originates with the same source. I believe the complaints about my bakery were filed by several of Vale's business associates and traced back to him eventually, she said. I expect this will have the same fingerprints. But I want to be clear about something, Mr. Holt. The fingerprints are yours and Silas's concern. My concern is whether anything I have done here is actually in violation of any actual law. Holt looked at her for a moment, then at Silas, then back at her. The complaint alleges that Braddock Ranch is operating a commercial dining establishment without county permits. He said, the specific claim is that you are serving meals for profit to members of the public. We are serving meals for a modest fee to travelers who arrive at the ranch, she said. Silas sets the price and collects the payment. I cook the food. We are on private ranch property. That's the crux of it, Holt said. There's a legal distinction between a ranch cook feeding guests who happen to pay something for the hospitality and a commercial kitchen operating for public profit. Question is which side of that line you fall on. Which side do we fall on? Silas said. He had been quiet during this exchange. She noticed not absent, not disengaged, but deliberately giving her the room to speak, which she found she was grateful for and irritated by in roughly equal measure, because she did not like needing to be grateful for space she should have been given automatically. With this documentation, Holt said, tapping the accounts book, and the right permits obtained before Thursday, I believe we can make a strong argument for the former. The problem is the permits. Some of them require a county inspection, and the inspector assigned to this district is a man named Connolly, who has, he paused, a professional relationship with several Copper Ridge merchants. The sentence landed in the room with the specific weight of something that was technically true and practically more complicated. He works for Vail, Beatrice said. He has received significant business from Vail's companies over the past 6 years, Holt said, which was, she recognized, the most accurate sentence she had heard all morning. Silas leaned forward. Can we request a different inspector? We can. Vail will likely contest it, but the request itself creates a paper trail that complicates his position. Holt closed the accounts book and slid it back to Beatrice. I want you to keep this. Don't let it out of your possession until Thursday. And I want you to write down everything you remember about the first complaint process against your bakery names. Sequence dates, sequence of events. Anything you can recall. I remember all of it, she said. He looked at her steadily. Write it down anyway, he said. Memory is easier to dismiss than ink. She took the accounts book and stood. Is there anything else? One more thing, Holt said. He seemed to be selecting his words. At the hearing Thursday, Fitch will likely bring documentation of his own. Vail's people are good at paperwork. I've seen them manufacture a very convincing paper version of whatever story suits them. I know, she said. I watched them do it 3 years ago. Then you know they're going to try to make this about your character, not your kitchen, Holt said. They will imply things about your arrangement here. He glanced briefly at Silas, which was brief enough to be professional and long enough to communicate exactly what he meant, and they will frame the question of your competence and your integrity in ways that have nothing to do with whether you obtained a permit. She had expected this. She had been expecting it since the morning at the fair when Vail walked past her table and said what he said. She still felt it land somewhere low in her chest, the way you can anticipate a bruise and still feel it when it comes. Let them try, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I've spent 6 weeks building something honest. I'd like to see him explain that to a room full of people who've eaten here. She left the office and walked back, through the main house and out to the covered walk, and stood there in the morning with her accounts book pressed to her chest, and her eyes book pressed to her chest, and her eyes on the stable across the yard, and she breathed. Just breathed. The particular, deliberate breathing of someone who is angry and frightened in proportions she is not prepared to share with anyone, and needs the anger to win. It was the fear she was careful about, anger she could use. Anger had gotten her out of the rented room and onto the wagon road north and into this kitchen. Fear, on its own, had only ever kept her still. She went back to her kitchen. There was breakfast to finish. Gerald Fitch returned on Thursday as promised, and he brought a second man with him, younger, carrying a leather document case that was too new for the amount of dust on the road that led to Braddock Ranch, which told her he had been handed it recently and given a job to do with it. Fitch was the kind of official who had learned to wear his authority like a coat. He was not entirely comfortable and present enough to function, loose enough to suggest he might shed it if the temperature in a room got high enough. They sat in Silas's office. Holt was there. Chester was there. Beatrice sat at the end of the table, nearest the window because she had arrived first and chosen the position deliberately. The light was good, and the sight lines were clear, and she had spent 3 years learning that the first thing a powerful man's emissary wants you to do is feel like you're in the wrong place in a room. She was not in the wrong place. She was exactly where she intended to be. Fitch laid out his documents. The complaint language was formal and dense, and full of the particular bureaucratic vocabulary that is designed to make simple accusations sound like complex legal infractions. She listened to all of it and took notes in the margin of a clean page in her accounts book and did not interrupt, because she had learned from the bakery that interrupting at this stage only makes you look reactive, and she was not reactive. She was prepared. When Fitch finished, Holt began his response, and he was good, methodical, precise. The kind of lawyer who understands that the most devastating thing you can do to an overbuilt complaint is dismantle it quietly, piece by piece, without raising your voice. He walked of its windows were dark, permit applications which had been filed 48 hours after their Tuesday meeting. He walked through the accounts book, which Beatrice passed across the table when Holt gestured for it. He walked through the legal distinction between ranch hospitality and commercial operation. The young man with the document case grew visibly uncomfortable around the 20-minute mark. Fitch held his position better, but she could see the recalculation happening behind his eyes the moment when an official who arrived expecting easy resistance encounters something more organized than expected and has to decide whether to push harder or start looking for a way. Conclude the meeting that doesn't make him appear to have been sent on a fool's errand. Pushed harder. These permits, Fitch said, require a facilities inspection before they can be approved. I have a scheduled inspector. We've filed a request for an alternate inspector, Holt said, on the grounds that the assigned inspector has a financial relationship with at least one of those parties who filed the original complaint. That request is with the county clerk as of this morning. Fitch blinked. That's an unusual. It's a standard procedural protection, Holt said pleasantly. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Another pause. The young man with the document case wrote something down. There's also, Fitch said, and his tone shifted slightly a half step into something that was trying to be delicate and not quite managing it, a matter of the nature of the arrangement here. Mrs. Hollowell is living on the property. He selected his word, a widow, living and working in close proximity to the ranch owner, who is her employer, Silas said. He had not spoken since the opening introductions. The room adjusted to his voice. Her employer, Silas said again. He was not loud. He was, if anything, quieter than normal, which she had learned in 6 weeks was the direction he went when something had genuinely irritated him rather than merely inconvenienced him. She has a private room above the stable, which she occupies alone. She works in the kitchen, which is a separate structure from the main house. She manages the feeding of 14 men and the accounting for this operation with more precision than anyone I have employed in 20 years. I'm interested in what part of that arrangement you're suggesting is improper, because I'd like to hear it said plainly rather than implied. Fitch did not say it plainly. This did not surprise her. What surprised her was what came next. She had not planned to speak at this meeting beyond answering direct questions. She had discussed this with Holt the night before. Her role was to be present, credible, documented, not to become the emotional center of the meeting, because that was exactly where Vale's strategy needed her to be. But Fitch's half-finished implication sat in the room like something rotting in warm weather, and she looked at Silas, who was looking at Fitch, and she looked at the young man with the document case, who was looking at his own hands, and she thought about 3 years ago, sitting in a room not unlike this one, saying nothing, waiting for the professionals to handle it, watching the machinery run over her anyway. Mr. Fitch, she said. He looked at her. I have been cooking professionally for most of my adult life, she said. I ran a bakery in Copper Ridge for 4 years. That bakery was closed by a campaign of false complaints and fabricated inspections that I could not at the time afford to fight. I know who ran that campaign. I suspect you know who filed the complaint that sent you to this ranch. I'm not asking you to confirm that, because I expect you won't. What I am asking is that you look at that accounts book, she nodded toward it on the table, and tell me one thing, one specific, documented thing that I have done wrong. Fitch looked at the accounts book. He did not open it. Permit situation, he began. Permits that we have now filed for, she said. Filed correctly, filed completely, with documentation that meets every county requirement. Is there anything else? The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone, but it was least comfortable for Fitch. I'll need to review the request for alternate inspector, he said finally, and the permit applications. Of course, Holt said. The meeting ended 20 minutes later without resolution, which was, Holt told her quietly, as Fitch's wagon disappeared down the road, actually the best possible outcome at this stage. No immediate action means they didn't have what they needed, he said. They'll regroup. But we've bought time and established our position. Vale won't stop at one meeting, she said. No, Holt agreed. He won't. He didn't. The next 2 weeks brought 2 more letters, one formally contesting the alternate inspector request, one raising a new separate complaint about the volume of wagon traffic accessing the ranch road, which was county maintained, and therefore, the letter argued, subject to commercial use restrictions. Beatrice read both letters when Silas showed them to her, and she added them to the section of her accounts book she had begun labeling, dryly, correspondence, and said nothing for a moment. "He's trying to bury you in process," she said. "He's trying to bury us both," Silas said. She noted the both and set it aside for later. It was Chester who came to her the following week with information she had not expected. Hued dark, he appeared at the cook shed door on a Tuesday evening when she was finishing the sup cleanup and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands in the way he did when he had something to say that he was not sure how to start. "The men want to do something," Chester said, "about the hearing. When it comes." She turned from the work table. "What do you mean?" "They've been talking," he said, "among themselves. Hank started it, which surprised me some, but there it is." He paused. "They want to write statements about the food and about you, about what this kitchen has meant to the ranch. Holt mentioned that character witnesses carry weight at county hearings, and the men—" Chester stopped, looked at his hat, looked at her. "They want to be on the record." She stood very still. "All of them?" she said. "All 12, Chester said. "And me makes 13. Silas will speak himself, of course, but that's separate." She turned back to the work table because she needed something to do with her hands. She picked up the cloth she'd been using to dry pots and folded it very precisely and set it on the shelf. "Tell them," she said, and her voice came out with a slight roughness she could not entirely prevent, "that I appreciate it more than I know how to say right now." Chester put his hat back on. "I'll tell them." He started to leave, then stopped. "Pete's been working on his for 3 days, he said. "Has 4 drafts already. Hank told him to stop overthinking it, but Pete's Pete." She almost smiled. "Tell Pete it doesn't have to be long," she said. "Just honest." Chester left, and she stood alone in the cook's shed with the folded cloth on the shelf, and she let herself feel, for approximately 90 seconds, what it was to have 12 cowboys and a foreman decide independently that she was worth fighting for. Not because she had asked, not because Silas had told them to, because they had sat at her table 3 times a day for 6 weeks, and been fed like people, and they remembered what that felt like, and they were not willing to stand by while someone took it from her. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, which was a thing she had not done in a considerable while, and then she opened her accounts book and kept working. The county hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in early October, 6 weeks after Fitch's first visit. By the Wednesday before it, Beatrice had not slept properly in 4 days. She knew this was not sustainable. And she knew that arriving at the hearing exhausted would not serve her. And she also knew that knowing these things and being able to act on them were not the same thing. The fear had been manageable while she was busy. Now, with the hearing 2 days away and the preparation largely complete, and nothing left to do but wait, the fear had time to move around and find all the soft places. She was at the work table at 2 in the morning when she heard the knock. Silas. She knew from the knock. 4 weeks of learning a cattle ranch, and the particular sound of 14 different pairs of boots had given her an involuntary catalog, and his was distinct, not loud, not tentative, exactly even. She opened the door. He was in his work clothes, which meant he had not slept either. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, which meant he had known the lamp would be lit. "I saw the light," he said anyway. "Come in," she said. He came in and set 1 cup in front of her on the work table and leaned against the wall in the position that was, she had realized some weeks ago, his position, the one he took in her kitchen when he was not in any hurry and did not have an agenda and was simply some quiet way present. They drank their coffee. The ranch was dark and silent outside the window. The sourdough crock on the shelf breathed softly in the warmth of the room. "You're going to be all right," he said, not as reassurance exactly. More as a statement of something he considered established fact. "You don't know that," she said. "I know Vale has tried to kill something you built before," he said. "And I know you're still here. That's a data point." She looked at her coffee. He had more leverage last time. "I was alone. I was grieving. I didn't understand what was happening until it had already happened." She paused. "I'm not making those mistakes again, but that doesn't mean he can't find new ones. No, Silas said, it doesn't. He was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something that is none of my business? She looked up at him. When I stopped at your table at the fair, he said, I wasn't looking for a cook. I was technically, Chester had been telling me for weeks I needed to solve the food situation, but that's not why I stopped. He looked at the window, at the dark outside it. I stopped because I watched a man walk past you and say something ugly, and I watched you not move, and I wanted to know who you were. He paused. I still want to know who you are. I figure I've learned some of it, but I think there's a lot I haven't. The silence in the room changed quality slightly. Silas, she said carefully. I'm not saying anything, he said quickly. I'm not, this isn't the time, and I'm aware of that. I just wanted you to know before Friday that what happens at that hearing matters to me beyond the ranch, beyond the business of it. He looked at her directly. You matter. That's all. She held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at this man who had stopped at the end of a row, Maine, when no one else did, and bought everything on her table and offered her something she hadn't known she needed and had spent 6 weeks treating her. Like a person with judgment worth respecting, and she thought about the wall she had built after Thomas, the long deliberate architecture of it, the maintenance it required. I don't know what to do with that, she said honestly. You don't have to do anything with it right now, he said. Friday first, she agreed. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, set it on the shelf. At the door he stopped. Holt says you should speak, he said. The hearing. Not just answer questions, speak. He says a room full of people from this county needs to hear what you know about what Vale does. He thinks it'll matter. I know, she said. I've been thinking about it. And she looked at the accounts book on the table. The weeks of careful numbers, the dates and payments and receipts. At everything she had built in this kitchen in 6 weeks, the sourdough, the reputation, the 14 men who would walk into a county hearing on her behalf because she had learned, who liked hard eggs and who needed a large noon meal, and what a boy far from home looked like when a bowl of stew reminded him that somebody cared. I'll speak, she said. The county courthouse in Copper Ridge seated approximately 80 people in its hearing room. By 8:30, on a Friday morning in October, it held closer to 110, with people standing along the back wall and crowded into the doorway that led to the building's small entrance hall. Beatrice had not expected this. She had expected the official parties, Fitch and his documents, Vale's attorneys, Holt, the county board members who would vote on the complaints, and perhaps a handful of interested townspeople. She had not expected Copper Ridge to show up. She sat beside Holt at the respondents' table and kept her hands flat on top of her accounts book and looked at the room. She recognized faces. The couple who had bought a pie from the table 2 spots down at the fair were in the 4th row. The nervous fair organizer Purcell was near the window, looking, for once, like he was watching something he hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Dowd from the fabric shop was in the back, expression unreadable. Behind the railing that separated the public from the official tables, the 12 ranch hands sat in 2 rows. They had clearly organized themselves. With Hank at the near end and young Pete beside him, holding a folded piece of paper with the particular grip of someone who has written 4 drafts of something and is not letting go of the 5th. Silas was behind her at the edge of the official area. She did not look at him, because if she looked at him, she would think about the cook shed at 2 in the morning and the coffee and the things he had said, and she needed to be focused. Vale was across the room. She had not seen him since the fair. He was with 2 attorneys she did not recognize, not local men, which meant he had spent money on this, real money, which meant he was more threatened than he wanted to appear. He was not looking at her. This was deliberate. The performance of not looking at someone in a room is louder than them. And he knew it, and she knew he knew it. She looked at him anyway. Just for a moment, long enough to measure. He looked exactly the same as he had looked at the fair, at the bakery, at every moment she had seen him over the years. Well-dressed, composed, the particular settled authority of a man who has never seriously doubted that rooms arrange themselves for him. He looked like a man who expected to win. Vale's attorneys went first, and they were as good as Holt had warned. The technical complaint language was reframed as a community concern, the permit issue elevated into a pattern of regulatory disregard, and at one point one of the attorneys, with careful casualness, referred to the arrangement at Braddock Ranch as one involving, and this was his exact phrase, questions of propriety that a respectable community has every right to examine. Several people in the room shifted in their seats. Holt dismantled the technical claims with the same quiet precision she had watched him use at the ranch, methodical, documented, unhurried. Permit applications filed and in order. The accounts book entered into the hearing record. The request for alternate inspector, procedurally proper and pending. The legal distinction between ranch hospitality and commercial operation, supported by case precedent from 2 other counties. When Holt finished, the board chair, a heavy-set man named Alcott, who had the look of someone who had been hoping this morning would be simpler than it was turning out to be, said, "Is there anything else for the respondent's side?" Holt looked at Beatrice. She stood. The room was not quiet exactly. It was the specific not silence of a crowd that has just made a collective decision to listen. She had thought about what she would say. She had written it down and thrown it away and thought about it again. Holt had advised her to keep it brief and factual and to resist the impulse to become emotional, which was good legal advice and almost entirely impossible in practice, so she had decided instead to simply tell the truth and let it be what it was. "My name is Beatrice Hollowell," she said. "I am a cook, and before that I was a baker, and before that I was a girl who learned to make bread at her mother's kitchen table. I have been doing this for most of my life, and I have done it honestly, and I have records to prove every transaction and every decision I have made since I arrived at Braddock Ranch 8 weeks ago." Paused. The room held. 4 years ago, I ran a bakery on the main street of this town. It was not a large business. It was not a powerful business. It was a place where I made things with my hands and sold them to people who wanted them. And for 3 years it was enough. And then it became successful enough that a man with more money and fewer scruples than I had decided it was inconvenient. And he filed complaints, and he arranged inspections, and he used the machinery of official process to manufacture a version of my business that bore no resemblance to what I was actually doing, and he did it until I couldn't fight it anymore, and I lost everything I had built. Vale. She looked at Alcott, and then at the room behind him. "I know what it looks like when that machinery starts," she said. "I know the language it uses, and the shape of its accusations, and the way it wraps a powerful man's self-interest in the vocabulary of public concern. I have been watching it run toward me again for the past 6 weeks, and I want to say something clearly, in front of everyone here, so that there is no question about where I stand." She picked up the accounts book from the table. "I have worked honestly," she said. "I have fed people well. I have broken no law. I have applied for every permit required of me the moment I understood one was needed. I have records of every cent that has passed through my kitchen. I have 14 men prepared to stand in this room and tell you what the food at Braddock Ranch has meant to them. And I have travelers from 3 counties who took detours out of their way to eat at a table I built with my own hands." She set the book down. "My only real offense," she said, "is succeeding again after a man with considerable resources decided 3 years ago that I should fail. And I would like the county of Copper Ridge to decide today, in this room, whether that is the kind of offense it intends to punish." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then someone in the 3rd row began to clap. It was not a dramatic eruption. It spread from the 3rd row outward and backward, with the particular character of applause that is not performance, but agreement. People who had come to watch finding themselves participating instead. Alcott made a half-hearted gesture toward order that no one acknowledged. Vale's attorneys exchanged a look. Vale himself, for the first time since she had known him, was looking at her. His expression was controlled. He was too practiced to let it collapse in public, but there was something behind the control that she recognized, because she had felt it herself in smaller moments over the years. He had not expected this. He had expected the room to be his room, the way rooms had always been his rooms, and he was sitting in it, watching it not be that, and the experience was new enough to show. Alcott called for the testimonials. Young Pete went first, because Hank had apparently made the executive decision at some point in the preceding days that Pete's 4-draft statement deserved the opening position, which was the most unexpectedly generous thing she had ever heard attributed to Hank, and which she intended to think about later. Pete stood up with his folded paper and unfolded it with shaking hands and read in a voice that started unsteady and straightened itself out by the third sentence. He said that he had come to Braddock Ranch at 17 with no particular reason to believe anyone would notice whether he showed up to meals or didn't, and that the first time he sat down to a proper breakfast in Beatrice's kitchen he had felt, for the first time since leaving his family's farm in Kansas, that somebody had considered whether he had eaten. He said that he understood this might sound like a small thing, and that he was aware it was a document about permits and legal compliance, but that he thought the boards were dark, but that he thought the board should know that the kitchen at Braddock Ranch was not just a place where food was made. It was a place where people were paid attention to. He sat down, and Hank reached over and slapped his shoulder once, which, for Hank, was equivalent to a standing ovation. 11 more statements followed, each one different, each one carrying its own particular weight. Reuben talked about his noon meals with the plain directness of a man who has never learned to dress things up. 2 of the younger hands were brief and factual and somehow more affecting for it. Chester read his statement in the monotone of a man who has strong feelings he considers private, which made every word of it land harder than it would have with any inflection. Hank went last among the ranch hands. He did not have a written statement. He stood up and looked at Alcott and said, "I want to say 2 things. First, I have eaten Mrs. Hollowell's cooking every day for 8 weeks, and I have not once eaten a bad meal, which is more than I can say for anywhere else I have worked in 20 years. Second, he paused, and something crossed his face that she had not seen there before, something that was not his usual comfortable authority. Second, that kitchen changed the character of our ranch. I don't know a better way to say it than that. Things are different because of what she built there. And whatever this process is deciding, I think the people in this room deserve to know it." He sat back down. Alcott looked at his fellow board members. He looked at Vale's attorneys. He looked at the room. The vote took 11 minutes. Every complaint was dismissed. The permits were approved pending a standard inspection by a neutral county official. The alternate inspector request had been granted 2 days before the hearing, which Holt had known and had chosen not to mention to her until this moment, pressing her hand briefly and saying, "I didn't want you to relax." She stood at the response table and heard the word dismissed, and felt it move through her in a way she had anticipated. Not triumph, exactly, not the clean, bright thing she might have expected. Something more complicated. Something that had to do with 3 years of carrying a weight she should never have been given, and the particular exhaustion of setting it down. She became aware that the room was loud again. She became aware that Silas was beside her, having come through the railing, and that he was not saying anything, just standing there with the particular solidity of a man who understands that some moments don't require words. She looked across the room. Vale was gathering his things. His attorneys were packing their cases. He was doing it efficiently, without drama. The controlled movements of a man who has decided that the best thing he can do with a loss he did not see coming is leave before anyone takes a photograph of his expression. He had walked away from her table at the fair and laughed. He was walking away from this room without laughing. She watched him go. She did not feel the satisfaction she might have expected. What she felt was something quieter and stranger, the specific sensation of a woman who has just discovered that the thing she was most afraid of, the thing that had defined the shape of 3 years of her life, had limits, that it could be answered, that she had just answered it in a room full of people with nothing but honest work and a leather-covered accounts book and 12 cowboys who had decided she was worth fighting for. Silas's hand found her elbow, the briefest contact, barely there, the question of it, rather than the thing itself. She exhaled. Outside the courthouse, the October light was sharp and clear, and somewhere down the road, 12 miles north, a sourdough crock was sitting on a shelf in a kitchen she had cleaned herself, breathing quietly in the warmth, waiting for her to come home. The ride back to the ranch was 12 miles of silence that did not feel empty. Chester drove the supply wagon with Holt's document case loaded in the back, and the 12 ranch hands went ahead on horseback in a loose group that moved with the particular energy of men who have done something they are quietly proud of and are not entirely sure how to carry it. Young Pete rode beside Hank for the first 3 miles without speaking, which was unusual for Pete, and which Hank appeared to find either companionable or at least tolerable, which was its own kind of progress. Beatrice sat on the bench seat of the smaller wagon beside Silas, who was driving, and watched the flat land open up on either side of the road, and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the horse moved at its steady pace, and the October sky was the particular hard blue that comes after a cold night. And she thought about the hearing room and the applause and Vale's face when the vote was read, and the word dismissed, and how it had felt to say out loud, in front of everyone, the things she had been carrying for 3 years. She thought about Pete's statement, about Hank standing up without a paper. She thought of Silas in the cook shed at 2 a.m, holding 2 cups of coffee. Session Friday first in the tone of a man establishing a reasonable order of operations for a conversation he intended to finish. She had not. Windows were dark. She had not forgotten that conversation. She had been putting it in the compartment she kept for things she was not ready to examine, and she had been keeping that compartment firmly shut. And somewhere around the 4th mile of the ride home, she admitted to herself that the compartment was considerably harder to keep shut than it had been before this morning. "You're thinking very loudly," Silas said. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't say it was a problem." She looked at the road. A hawk was working a thermal somewhere above the fence line to the west, circling without apparent effort. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right." "When you came to the cook shed that night," she said, carefully, "the night before the hearing, you said I matter. Beyond the ranch and the business of it." She paused. "Did you mean that?" As she stopped, because there were several ways to finish the sentence, and none of them felt safe. "Yes," he said. "Simple as that." She looked at him. He was watching the road with the focused peripheral awareness of a man who is driving a horse and simultaneously having a conversation that requires full attention and is managing both without making a performance of either. "I'm not easy to know," she said. "I want you to understand that. I have been working very hard for 3 years at being a specific kind of person, self-sufficient, careful, not needing anything I can't provide myself, and that kind of work leaves marks. It becomes the thing you are instead of something you chose." "I know," he said. "You can't know that already. We've known each other 8 weeks. I know it from watching you," he said. "The way you run a kitchen that is technically someone else's, like it is absolutely and completely yours. The way you talk to the men, you give every one of them exactly what they need, and you don't confuse those things with what you need yourself. The way you sat in that hearing room this morning and said what you said." He was quiet for a moment. A person who does all of that is not someone who arrived at it easily. She sat with this. Thomas was easy, she said, and she had not planned to say it. It surfaced the way things do when your guard has been lowered by relief and October light and a long night with not enough sleep. He was easy to know, easy to be with. He thought everything I did was right, which was wonderful and also not entirely accurate. And I knew it, and I loved him anyway. She paused. "I don't know how to do something that isn't easy. I don't know what I'm like when it's hard." "You were hard this morning," Silas said. "In a hearing room against a man who has beaten you before. You know what you're like." She thought about this. "That's different," she said. "That's a fight. I know how to fight. I have been fighting since Thomas died because it was the only thing standing between me and losing everything. What I don't know is," she stopped again. "What?" "How to want something," she said, very quietly, without immediately calculating how bad it will be when it's gone. The wagon moved through a long curve in the road, and the ranch came into view ahead, the cluster of buildings, the fencing, the stable with her room above it. Home was not a word she had used for it yet. She had been careful about that word. Silas was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not going to tell you not to calculate," he said finally. "That's part of who you are, and I don't want a different version of you. But I'll say this," he glanced at her, brief and direct. "I'm not Thomas. Easy is not a word anyone has used about me. And I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm asking if you're willing to find out what careful looks like when it's allowed to also be something else." She did not answer him right then, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was still forming, and she had learned that answers which need forming deserve time. They pulled into the ranch yard, and Chester was already unloading the supply wagon, and 3 of the ranch hands were at the stable, and the ordinary machinery of the afternoon reasserted itself with the reliable density of work that does not pause for personal revelations. Beatrice climbed down from the wagon and went to her kitchen, and Silas took the horse to the stable, and the day continued. But something had shifted. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in weather. Before it fully arrives, a pressure difference, a quality of air, something your body registers before your mind has caught up with it. The week after the hearing moved differently than weeks before it had. The first change was the women. 3 days after the hearing, a woman appeared at the ranch gate on foot. She was perhaps 40, heavy-set, wearing a good coat that had seen better years, carrying a cloth bag, and an expression that suggested she had been working up to this walk for some time, and was not entirely sure she should have made it. Chester brought her to the cook shed because he apparently considered this to be Beatrice's jurisdiction, which it was. Her name was Clara Voss. She was a widow. Her husband had died of a fever the previous spring, and she had been working in Copper Ridge doing laundry and mending since, and she was good at those things, but they weren't paying enough. And she had heard, at the hearing, when Beatrice said certain things about women who needed work, and she wanted to know if there was anything at the ranch she could do. Beatrice looked at her hands. She had learned years ago that hands were what told you the truth about a person's relationship with work, not the roughness, necessarily, but how they sat, how they moved, whether there was any particular comfort in them. Clara Voss's hands had the particular stillness of someone waiting to be told she was in the wrong place. "Can you cook?" Beatrice asked. "I can manage," Clara said. "I'm not fancy about it." "I'm not looking for fancy," Beatrice said. "I'm looking for someone who won't poison the men and is willing to learn the rest." "But come in." Clara came in. Within 3 days, it was apparent that Clara Voss was in fact a competent cook who had been doing it her entire adult life and had simply never been in a situation where that competence had been recognized as worth paying for. She was quiet in a way that was different from Beatrice's quiet. It was the quiet of someone who had learned that taking up too much space attracted unwanted attention, and Beatrice recognized it and said nothing about it directly, but began gradually to give her more room at the work table and more authority over the decisions that didn't require the specific knowledge only Beatrice had. The second woman arrived the following week. Her name was Nora Fenn. She was 22, single, and had been working at her father's feed supply business since she was 14. Her father, she explained without particular bitterness, most of its windows were dark, had hired a male cousin to take over the counter work because he thought it looked better for the business, and Nora was now available for other employment and had heard that Braddock Ranch was the place to come if you were available and capable, and had previously been overlooked. This last part she said with a directness that Beatrice found immediately useful. "You've heard correctly," Beatrice said.
"What can you do?"
"I can do accounts," Nora said. "I kept my father's books for 6 years. I can organize. I can follow a recipe if it's written clearly, and I can write one down once you show me something twice." Beatrice hired her on the spot, which surprised even herself a little, but she was looking at the travelers, increasing week over week, and the accounts book that was requiring and more of her time to maintain, while simultaneously running a kitchen that was feeding more people than it had been designed for. And Nora Fenn and her 6 years of ledger keeping arrived at exactly the right moment. Silas said nothing about any of this. He observed it with the particular quality of attention that she had come to understand was his version of engaged interest, quiet, present, taking things in without commenting until he had something specific to say. He said something specific on the evening after Nora's first week. He found her in the cook shed doing the accounts, which was where he usually found her in the evening when she wasn't actively cooking, and he poured himself coffee from the pot she kept on the back of the range at all hours and leaned against the wall and said, "You're building something." "I'm running a kitchen," she said. "You're running a kitchen, training a widow, and organizing a 22-year-old who is better at accounts than I am," he said. "That's not just a kitchen." She set pen down. "Is that a concern?" "No," he said. "It's an observation. I'm interested in where it goes." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "An idea. I don't know if it's practical." "Tell me." She had been turning it over for 2 weeks. Since Clara's first day, since she had seen the specific quality of relief on Clara's face when Beatrice handed her an apron and said, "Come in," as if it were the simplest thing in the world, which it was, and also wasn't. She had been of its windows, been thinking about the women who had come to the hearing, the ones she had seen in the back rows watching she snorting when she stood up to speak. She had been thinking about what she had said about a man who decided she should fail, and the particular silence that had followed it, the way certain silences mean that a room full of people has just recognized something they had not previously had the language for. The meal service is growing, she said. Travelers, occasional groups, it's not stopping. And I have Clara now, and Nora, and I've been thinking that this could be more than it is, more intentional. A real dining operation, properly permitted and organized, with a name and a reputation as the structure. She paused. Not just a ranch kitchen that happens to feed outsiders. Something that is actually what it is. Silas was very still. And, she continued, because there was an and she was going to say it, some of its windows were dark. Something that employs women who need work and won't get it from the rest of this county without someone making them a door. Because I can teach. I've known that since Pete started washing pots and Hank backed down from the egg argument, I can take someone who knows some of it and teach them the rest. And there are women in this county who need exactly that. The silence in the room had a specific texture. She waited in it. On the ranch, he said. It wasn't a question, but it was looking for confirmation. I'm aware this is your property. I'm not asking you to hand it over. I'm asking if you'd be willing to be a partner in something that starts here and becomes its own thing. Partner, he said. A business partner, she said firmly. I want to be clear about what I'm asking. He almost smiled. The almost smiles was something she had cataloged somewhere around week 3 and had been unable to unnotice since. What would it be called? She had thought about this too. My name should be on it, she said. Not in a way that erases yours. This is your land and your resources and your kitchen, and that matters. But my name should be on it because the last time I built something and my name wasn't on it in a way that people understood as mine, it was easier to take from me. She held his gaze. I want to call it Hollowell and Braddock. A long pause. Alphabetical order, he said. H comes before B, she said. It does, he agreed. And this time the almost smile arrived completely. They worked out the structure over 3 evenings at the work table in the cook shed, with the accounts book open and Nora's organizational framework and a pot of coffee that was replaced twice. It was not a simple negotiation. Beatrice had opinions about how the kitchen should be run that were not negotiable, and Silas had practical concerns about ranch operations and resource allocation that were legitimate, and they disagreed on 2 specific points loudly enough that Clara, who was washing pots in the corner during the second evening's session, made herself very quiet indeed. The first disagreement was about expansion of the physical space. Beatrice wanted a larger kitchen, not bigger for the sake of bigger, but bigger, because what she was describing required more work table space and a second range and proper cold storage, and the current cook shed was already at its limits. Silas's concern was cost, which was fair, and timing, which was also fair. They spent 40 minutes on it, before arriving at a compromise that involved phased construction over 2 seasons, with the first phase beginning in spring. Second disagreement was sharper and closer to something neither of them had said plainly. It was about the room above the stable. Silas said, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been thinking about something for some time, that if this was going to be a real business operation, Beatrice should have proper accommodations in the main house, not a room above the stable, because the optics of the arrangement as it stood would continue to give Vale and people like Vale something to work with. Beatrice said that she would not move into the main house. He asked why. She looked at him across the work table, with Clara very quiet in the corner and the lamp making everything warm and close, and said, because if I move into the main house under these circumstances, every decision I make professionally will be read through the lens of where I sleep. And I cannot afford that, and you know I cannot afford that. He was quiet for a moment. You could afford it more now than you could 8 weeks ago, he said. The hearing was 6 weeks ago, she said. Vale has not filed a new complaint yet, which means he hasn't found his next angle, which means he is still looking. I am not giving him the main house. Another pause. And when there is no next angle, he said, when he runs out of them, then we'll talk about the main house, she said. Clara, in the corner, set down a pot with a small deliberate clank that functioned, Beatrice suspected, as a tactful indication that she was still present. The conversation moved back to the accounts, but the question hung in the room, and both of them knew it, And after Silas left, and Clara finished the pots and said goodnight, Beatrice sat alone at the work table, with the lamp burning low, and admitted to herself what she had been careful not to admit while he was in the room. She was afraid. Not of Vale, not any more, not in the way she had been afraid of him before the hearing. She was afraid of the slow, irreversible thing that was happening between herself and Silas Braddock, in the evenings over the work table and in the mornings over coffee and in the 12 miles of road between Copper Ridge and the ranch, and in every small specific moment of being actually known by another person after 3 years of deliberate isolation. Thomas had been easy. She had said that to Silas, and she had meant it. Thomas had seen her as she wished to be seen, and she had loved him for it. And his death had taken not just the man, but the version of herself she had only been able to be with him. Silas saw her as she was, not the wished-for version. The actual version, difficult and careful and capable, and occasionally wrong and very stubborn about eggs, among other things. That was harder to receive. It was also, she was slowly understanding, more durable. She closed the accounts book and went upstairs to her room above the stable and lay awake for a while looking at the ceiling, and then she slept, and in the morning she was up at 4 making bread. November arrived with cold that came earlier than expected, and the cook shed required a fire in the range by 3 in the morning, or the kitchen was too cold to work in by 4. Beatrice adjusted without complaint, which was easier than it might have been because she had already been waking at 3 to think. So the fire gave the thinking something useful to do alongside it. The third woman came in November. She was not a widow. She was 56 years old. Her name was Ruth Alderman, and she had been a cook at the Ridge Hotel for 11 years, until the hotel's new management had decided, politely and with a small severance, that they preferred someone younger for the dining room. Ruth was not polite about this. She arrived at Braddock Ranch on a Tuesday morning, found Beatrice in the cook shed, and said without preamble, "I heard you're taking on women nobody else will hire. I'm 56 and I've been cooking professionally since I was 22, and I have references from half the county, and apparently none of that matters anymore. Are you interested or not?" Beatrice looked at her. Ruth Alderman had the bearing of a woman who had cooked in professional kitchens for 34 years and had never once had to justify it to anyone younger than herself. And the experience of having to justify it now was something she was managing with the particular dignity of a person who refuses to let indignity be the last word. "What's your bread like?" Beatrice asked. Ruth blinked. "What? Your bread? What's it like?" "It's excellent," Ruth said with the absolute confidence of a professional who does not traffic in false modesty about her core competency. "Good," Beatrice said, "because I need someone who can run the morning bread production while I'm managing the traveler service. Pay is," she named a figure. Ruth named a different figure. They negotiated for 4 minutes and agreed on a third figure that was between the two but slightly closer to Ruth's, which was fair because Ruth was right about her value, and Beatrice knew it. Ruth started to follow the following Monday, and within 1 week had reorganized the bread schedule in a way that was more efficient than Beatrice's system, and that Beatrice adopted without ego because she was not interested in being the smartest person in her own kitchen if it meant the bread was worse. Clara and Nora and Ruth formed a working arrangement that Beatrice did not engineer exactly, but watched develop with the interest of someone observing something she had theorized about, in her accounts book becoming actual. They were different women, different ages, different histories. What they shared was the specific experience of having been told, explicitly or implicitly, that what they did was not worth serious consideration, and the specific hunger that comes from having that decision reversed. The kitchen became a different kind of place. It had been efficient before. Now it was efficient, and something that had to do with the sound of women working alongside each other, the particular texture of a professional space occupied by people who are allowed to be competent without having to justify it. The way Ruth started showing Clara technique on a Wednesday afternoon, not because anyone asked her to, but because she noticed Clara struggling with it and had 34 years of professional knowledge and apparently no instinct against sharing it. Most of its windows were dark. Beatrice stood in the doorway of her own kitchen on a Thursday morning watching this and thought, "This is what I wanted when I didn't know I wanted it." Silas found her there, standing in the doorway, watching the 3 women work. He stood beside her and looked at the same thing for a moment. It's working, he said. Yes, she said. He was quiet. Then, I've been thinking about what you said, about your name going on it. She looked at him. I want you to know that I have no ambiguity about it, he said. Hollowell and Braddock. Your name first. Whatever comes next. She looked back at the kitchen, at Clara and Nora and Ruth, at the bread in the oven and the coffee on the range and the accounts book on the shelf, in Nora's meticulous new handwriting. Thank you, she said. She meant it more than the 2 words could carry, which he seemed to understand because he nodded and didn't push for more. The 4th woman arrived in December. She was not what Beatrice expected, which was becoming a pattern that she found herself grateful for. Her name was Ida Mae Collier. She was 16 years old. She appeared at the ranch gate on a Saturday morning alone, on foot, having apparently walked 4 miles from the edge of town, and when Chess brought her to Beatrice, she was cold and clearly had been working up the nerve for this walk since before she started it. I want to learn, Ida Mae said, to cook. Properly. Not just at home, I mean like you do. Like a profession. Beatrice looked at her. She was a small girl, sharp-eyed, with the particular quality of determination that sits in someone's jaw when they've made a decision they know will be resisted. Does your family know you're here? Beatrice said. My mother knows, Ida Mae said. My father doesn't know yet, but my mother said she'd handle my father. Beatrice thought about this for a moment. Then she thought about herself at 16, her mother's kitchen, the bread dough under her hands, the first time she understood that she was good at something. Can you be here every morning by 5? She said. Yes, Ida Mae said without hesitation. You'll start by watching, Beatrice said. You don't touch anything without permission for the first 2 weeks. You ask questions and you listen to the answers. You do what you're told without arguing about it, and if you disagree with something, you tell me afterward, not during. Those terms are acceptable. Come back Monday. Ida Mae came back Monday. Came back every day after that. She was, as Ruth observed dryly by the end of the 2nd week, a natural, which was both encouraging and slightly inconvenient, because it made her hard to teach in the traditional sequential manner and better managed by simply giving her harder things to try before she was technically ready, which was the method Beatrice had been taught by her mother, and which she had always slightly resented and now fully understood. December moved into the deep cold that Copper Ridge winters required, and the dining operation at Braddock Ranch continued. Through it, fewer travelers in the worst weather, but enough to keep the accounts book growing in Nora's steady handwriting, enough to keep the 4 women working and learning and building the specific confidence of people who are given the room to be good at things. Most of its windows were dark, and Beatrice was building something else in the spaces between the kitchen and the accounts and the morning bread and the 4 women and the 12 cowboys who still came to her table 3 times a day like a fact of the universe. She was building the courage to stop calculating every step. It happened on an evening in late December that was cold enough to make the covered walk between the cook shed and the main house uncomfortable to cross, and she had crossed it anyway because Silas had asked her to come look at the plans for the first phase of construction, which Holt had drafted with a surveyor's help, and which needed her input before they could be finalized. She looked at the plans. She gave her input. They discussed the spring timeline and the budget revision that the construction required, and Silas made notes, and she made notes, and it was, on its surface, entirely a business meeting, which she was aware was not what it was. When they had finished with the plans, Silas made her tea, because he had learned that she preferred tea in the evening when coffee would keep her awake, which was the kind of small knowledge that accumulates between 2 people over time, and that she was now entirely unable to pretend had not accumulated. She sat across the desk from him and held the tea and looked at the plans spread between them and said, without planning to, I think I'm done being afraid of this. He was very still. Of what specifically, he said carefully. Of wanting something without calculating how bad it will be when it's gone, she said. She had said those words to him on the wagon road in October, and he had not forgotten them. She could see that, and she was saying them again now as a way of indicating that she had arrived somewhere new with respect to them. He set down his pen. I want to be honest with you, she said. I'm still cautious. I'm not going to stop being cautious, because one winter has gone better than expected. I have a business to build, and women depending on my judgment, and a man in Copper Ridge who has not run out of angles yet. I cannot be careless. I know, he said, But I also, she stopped and started again. I am tired of the wall. I built it for good reasons, and it has served its purpose. And I am tired of maintaining it. She looked at him. That's what I wanted to say. The room was quiet. Cold pressed against the window from outside. The lamp on the desk made everything close and warm. I've been waiting for you to get there, he said. I want you to know I wasn't impatient about it. I know you weren't, she said. That's part of what got me there. The conversation that followed was not dramatic. Most of its windows were dark. It was two people talking plainly about what they were and what they wanted, and what they were both afraid of, which was considerable, because Silas had his own losses and his own walls, and she had been watching him maintain them for 4 months with the same discipline she had been applying to her own. He had lost his first wife 12 years before, not to death, but to a decision she had made about what kind of life she wanted, which was not a life on a cattle ranch 12 miles from the nearest town, and he had spent 12 years deciding whether that said something about him or about her, and had mostly concluded it was the latter, but not without some cost. He said this plainly, without self-pity, which she found considerably more moving than self-pity would have been. She told him about Thomas in more detail than she had told anyone, since Thomas died not the grief, which she had processed in her own way, but Thomas himself, who he was, what they had been to each other, the specific ways in which loving an easy man had not prepared her for the question of a difficult one. They sat in the office for 2 hours, and the tea went cold, and at some point Silas got up and added wood to the stove without asking and sat back down, and she thought, this is what known feels like. Not perfect, just real. She did not stay. She went back to her room above the stable and lay awake for a while, but it was a different kind of awake, not the calculating, cautious insomnia she had been managing for 3 years, but something closer to the particular alertness of a person who has just put something down and is noticing with surprise how light the world feels without it. January brought a specific kind of quiet that January on a cattle ranch always brings. The work continues. The cold makes everything harder, and the days are short enough that by the time supper is done and the kitchen is cleaned, the dark has been complete for several hours. Beatrice found herself in this quiet without the anxiety that had accompanied previous quiets. She was sleeping better. This was not a small thing. She and Silas settled into a pattern that was not any category she had a name for and that she decided did not need one. He came to the cook shed in the mornings for coffee, not every morning, but most of them. The Garretts. She came to the office in the evenings sometimes for planning discussions, and they were not always entirely planning discussions. They were careful with each other in the way of two people who understand that what they are building is fragile, a specific way, that new things are fragile, before they have had time to prove their own weight. February brought news from Copper Ridge that arrived via Chester, who had it from the grain mill, which had it from someone who had seen the county filing. Vale had not filed new complaints against Braddock Ranch. He had instead filed 2 new complaints against different businesses in Copper Ridge, a seamstress who had expanded her operation, and a blacksmith who had taken on an apprentice from outside the county, and both complaints had been met. The grain mill reported, with immediate organized resistance from the affected parties and several of their neighbors, who had apparently been paying attention at the October hearing. Chester delivered this information to Beatrice in the cook shed on a Thursday morning with the particular economy of a man who considers the relevant facts to be self-evident. It seems the county has developed a lower tolerance for a certain kind of complaint, Chester said. Beatrice stirred her coffee and said nothing for a moment. He'll adjust, she said. He'll find a new method. Possibly, Chester said, but methods take time to develop. And while he's developing the next one, he gestured at the cook shed, at Nora bent over the accounts, at the sound of Ruth's voice in the back kitchen, teaching Clara something about pie crust. Building, she finished. Yes, Chester said. He put his hat on and went back out, and she stood in her kitchen with the warmth of 4 women working and the cold February pressing at the window and the sounds of a ranch day beginning outside, and she thought, he's right. Every week that passed was a week of building. Every loaf of bread, every traveler, every carefully maintained receipt in the accounts book, every morning that Ida May arrived at 5 o'clock sharp and stood at the work table with her hands ready and her eyes open. Every evening that Nora updated the ledger in her precise handwriting. Every lesson that Ruth gave Clara without being asked. Vale could adjust. He could find new methods. She believed he would, because men like Vale did not simply stop. They recalculated and returned, and she would be ready when they did. But she was also not waiting for him. That was the change. That was the thing she had not had before, not the hearing, not the accounts book, not even the 4 women in her kitchen, though all of those mattered. The change was that she was not organized primarily around defense anymore. She was not spending her mornings calculating how to protect what she had, and her evenings going over the ways it could be taken. She was spending them building. It was on a Sunday evening in late February. The kitchen was clean, and Nora and Clara and Ruth had gone home, and Ida May had been walked to the gate by Pete, who had developed an entirely transparent and utterly unconcealed interest in walking Ida May to the gate that everyone on the ranch was carefully not commenting on. It was on that Sunday evening that Silas came to the cook shed and knocked, and came in and stood in his position against the wall and said, "I want to ask you something." She was at the work table with her coffee and her accounts. She looked up. "All right," she said. He did not look nervous. He was not a nervous man, and she had never seen him be one. But there was a particular quality of deliberateness about him in this moment, the specific care of someone saying something they have thought about for a long time and want to say correctly. "When I imagine the rest of my life," he said, "I cannot imagine it without you in it. Not the ranch, not the business, not the kitchen." He paused. "You, I want to ask you to marry me. Not because it helps the operation or because it answers anyone's questions about propriety, or because it's the practical next step. Because I cannot imagine the alternative, and I don't want to." She looked at him. She thought about the end of the row at the harvest fair in August, the empty table, the $1.40, the feel of his $5 bill under her hand. She thought about the cook shed at 2 in the morning and the road north and the sourdough crock and the 12 men who had gone to a county hearing with written statements because she had learned who among them liked hard eggs. She thought about Clara's hands on the day she arrived, how still they had been. She thought about Pete's 4 drafts. She thought about Pete's Clara pie crust on a Thursday afternoon because she had the knowledge and Clara needed it, and there was no reason in the world not to share it. She thought about the wall she had built after Thomas, the maintenance it had required, how tired she was. "Yes," she said. She said it plainly, with no performance, because that was how he had asked. It seemed right to answer the same way. He crossed the room, and she stood, and the distance between them, which had been carefully maintained for 4 months, with the particular discipline of 2 people who understood what they were doing, was no longer there, and she found she did not miss it. They stood in the cook's shed, with the lamp burning and the cold outside, and the sourdough crock on the shelf breathing quietly, and she thought, "This is not easy. This is better than easy." She had always known the difference. She had simply needed 4 months in a county hearing, and 4 women, and 12 cowboys, and 12 miles of road, and 1 man who stopped at a table at the end of a row to remember that she knew it. She pulled back first, because there was still coffee on the work table, and her accounts book was open to a page she had not finished, and she was Beatrice Hollowell, and she did not leave pages half finished. "I have a condition," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "The dining house," she said, "when we open it. My name goes first." "We agreed on that in October," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to say it again. Hollowell and Braddock," he said. H before B alphabetical. The almost smile arrived completely. "Good," she said, and sat back down at the work table and picked up her pen. He poured himself the last of the coffee and leaned against the wall in his position, and she went back to her accounts, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the silence was not empty, and had not been for some time, and both of them knew it, and neither of them required it to be said. Outside, the February dark was complete, and 12 miles south, Copper Ridge was going about its evening, and somewhere in the county Orson Vale was calculating his next angle, and spring was coming, which meant construction, which meant the first phase of what Beatrice had written in her accounts book as H&B Phase 1 in the same small, precise handwriting she used for everything that mattered. She turned the page and kept working. Spring came to the ranch the way it always does in that part of the country, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. 3 warm days followed by a hard frost. Mud that made the yard nearly impassable for a week, then dried to cracked earth almost overnight. The cattle grew restless in the way cattle do when they can smell the season changing, but the ground hasn't caught up, and the ranch hands worked longer days managing the resulting complications, and they came to Beatrice's table hungry, in a way that was different from winter hungry, more urgent, almost optimistic, like their bodies had decided something was beginning whether the weather agreed or not. She felt it too. The construction on the first phase of H&B began in the second week of March, which was later than Silas had planned due to a delivery delay on the lumber, and which Beatrice had used the extra 2 weeks to resolve by reorganizing the existing cook shed layout in a way that pre-anticipated the new space, so that when the wall between the old structure and the new addition finally came down in early April, the kitchen absorbed the expansion as if it had always known it was coming, standing in the new space on the first morning after the wall came down. Well, now we can actually work. This was from Ruth, the equivalent of a standing ovation. The second range was installed the following week. It was not new. Silas had found it through a ranch supply contact 2 counties over, a commercial model from a hotel that had closed, solid iron and well-maintained, and when Beatrice first fired it up and held her hand near the surface and felt the even, reliable heat coming off it, she understood why professional kitchens in cities were organized around equipment rather than improvisation. She had been improvising for 8 months. The second range felt like being handed a proper tool after a long time making do with a workaround. Ida May immediately claimed the new range as her primary station, which Beatrice allowed because Ida May's development had reached the point where giving her more responsibility was more useful than keeping her in the training posture. In 8 months, the girl had gone from watching silently at the work table to being the person Ruth asked for help when something complicated needed a second pair of hands. This had happened faster than Beatrice expected and slower than Ida May wanted, which was exactly the right pace. "You're going to be better than me eventually," Beatrice told her on a Tuesday in April, without particular fanfare, while they were both working and neither of them was looking at the other. Ida May was quiet for a moment. Then, "You think so?" "I know so," Beatrice said, "which means I need to teach you everything I know before that happens, and you stop needing my input." "I'll always need your input," Ida May said. "No, you won't," Beatrice said, "and that's the point." Ida May didn't say anything after that. Most of its windows were dark, but Beatrice caught the expression on her face in her peripheral vision, something that was trying not to be overwhelmed and not entirely succeeding, and she turned back to her own work and said nothing more about it, because some things are better received when you keep moving past them. The wedding was in April, as well, small and plain, in the way that both of them wanted, which was one of the first things they had agreed on easily. Beatrice had no family to invite except a cousin in Kansas she had not seen in 11 years and who could not make the trip, and she wrote the cousin a letter about it that took 3 drafts to find the right tone and sent it without knowing what response to expect. The ranch hands were present, all 12 of them, and Chester and Clara, Ruth, Nora, and Ida May, and Holt because Silas had worked with him long enough that not inviting him would have been an oversight rather than a decision. It was held in the yard because neither of them was inclined to crowd into a small room when the April air was clean and the yard was dry for once. Beatrice wore a dress she had made herself over the winter, from fabric she had ordered through the Copper Ridge dry goods store, dark blue because she had learned that dark blue suited her better than the colors she had been wearing since Thomas's death, which tended toward the practical grays and browns of someone who has decided that appearance is a luxury they can't afford to think about. The dress was not elaborate. It was well made, which was different. Clara cried during the short ceremony, which surprised everyone, including Clara. She apologized afterward, and Beatrice said there was nothing to apologize for, and Clara said, "It's just you deserve this." And Beatrice held the sentence for a moment and then said, "So do you," which sent Clara into a second wave of tears that Ruth addressed by handing her a dish towel and telling her to pull herself together because there was still dinner to get on. Hank gave a toast that was 4 sentences long and was the most economical expression of genuine feeling she had heard from any human being, and young Pete applauded so hard for it that he hurt his hands. Silas, beside her through all of it, was Silas present and particular, and slightly amused at Pete's hands, and not once looking like a man who was performing an occasion rather than living one. That evening, After the dinner and the cleaning up and the gradual departure of everyone back to their respective corners of the ranch, they sat together on the covered porch of the main house, which was now, in the formal sense, also Beatrice's house, though she continued to feel the novelty of this in small, unexpected moments. The way you find a step is higher or lower than you expected in the dark, and the night was cold enough to need a coat, but not cold enough to go inside. Most as if it's dark, and they sat in that specific comfort that two people arrive at when they have stopped performing ease at each other and arrived at the actual thing. "Are you going to keep the room above the stable?" Silas said. "For what purpose?" she said. "I don't know. In case you need somewhere to be alone." She thought about this honestly. "I might," she said. "Sometimes." "That's fine," he said. She looked at the dark yard, at the stable, at the faint outline of the cook shed, with its new addition, making the roofline asymmetrical in the way that new construction always does before the eye adjusts. "Are you going to tell me things are going to be all right now?" she said. "Because of the wedding. People do that." "No," he said. "Things might be difficult." Vale hasn't stopped. The construction isn't finished. Ida May's father sent another letter last week expressing reservations about her employment here, and I haven't told you because I didn't want to bother you with it right before the wedding. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you now." "What does the letter say specifically?" "That he considers her association with the ranch to be," Silas paused, selecting the word carefully, "of questionable benefit to a girl of her character and situation." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. The cold pressed down from above. Somewhere in the cattle pens, something moved and settled. "Is he going to pull her?" she said. "I don't think so. Her mother has made her position clear, apparently, and her mother's position aligns with Ida May's." He paused. "But I thought you should know." "I'll speak with Ida May tomorrow," Beatrice said. Its windows were dark. "She should know her father's concerned, and she should hear it from me rather than find out some other way." Silas nodded. She had noticed, over the months, that he nodded when he agreed with a decision without feeling the need to add anything to the agreement, which was a quality she found she deeply appreciated in another person after a lifetime of people who needed to elaborate on their agreements. "The dining house," she said. "When do you think we'll be ready?" "If the second phase finishes on schedule, the dining room addition, and the cold storage, I'd say early spring next year," he said. "Realistically, given how the lumber delivery went, late spring to be safe." She did the calculation in her head. 14 months from now, possibly 12 if things ran well, which things rarely did. "I can work with that," she said. She was already building the structure of it in her mind, the menu, the scheduling, the way the four women's skills would be redistributed across a proper dining operation versus the current hybrid arrangement. She was thinking about what a real dining house would need that the cook shed operation didn't have. And she was thinking about which of those things she could anticipate and which would surprise her, because there was always something that surprised you, no matter how carefully you planned. Orson Vale's next move came in May, and it was different from the previous ones in a way that took her a moment to recognize. He did not file complaints. He did not send inspectors. What he did, instead, was open a dining room at his own establishment on the main street of Copper Ridge, a formal dining room, properly appointed, with a menu that had been clearly dark, with a menu that had been clearly developed by someone who understood what made Beatrice's cooking appealing and had attempted to replicate the general spirit of it with a professional cook imported from the city. Holt brought her this information on a Thursday visit, and he watched her face carefully as he delivered it. She thought about it for a moment. "He's trying to compete," she said. "He's trying to make your operation redundant before it formally opens," Holt said. "If he can establish himself as the dining destination in the county before Hollowell and Braddock opens." "He can't," she said. Holt looked at her. "You're confident. His cook doesn't know these people," she said. "I know which of the hands likes hard eggs. I know that Reuben needs a large noon meal. I know that Pete has been taking extra bread home on Saturdays since October, because there's a girl in town he's been sharing it with, which means I know that my bread is being eaten in a context I didn't plan for, and it's working as an ambassador." She paused. "You cannot replicate that with a hired cook from the city, no matter how good the dining room looks. That knowledge takes time. Vale doesn't have the time, and he doesn't have the patience, and, more importantly, he's never understood that feeding people is not about the food. What is it about? Attention, she said, paying attention to who they are. She watched Vale's dining room through the spring and summer with a particular quality of attention she gave to things that were relevant to her operation. She watched the initials novelty draw customers. She watched the menu change twice in 8 weeks, which told her the hired cook and Vale's management were disagreeing about direction. She received through the reliable channel of Chester's grain mill contacts reports that Vale's dining room was expensive enough that the regular working population of Copper Ridge found it occasional rather than habitual. Meanwhile, the travelers kept coming to Braddock Ranch. By June, they were averaging 6 a day on weekdays and 11 on Saturdays. Nora's accounts showed a consistent profit that had allowed Beatrice to expand Ruth's hours and give Clara a small raise that Clara had not asked for and received with the particular gratitude of someone who had not been given things without asking for a long time. The summer was not easy. Summer on a ranch never is. The heat returned, different from the previous summer, only in that Beatrice was not living above a feed store and selling bread to nobody. She was managing a kitchen with 4 women and a feeding operation that had become, without formal announcement, the thing that travelers in the district planned around when they were moving through the county. She was also, simultaneously, planning a wedding that had already happened, managing construction that was behind schedule, and navigating the specific daily complexity of being married to a man she lived and worked with on the same 12 acres. That last part had its own difficulties, which she had known it would, and which she did not resent, but also did not pretend away. Silas and Beatrice were both people who had been living alone, professionally and personally, for a significant number of years, and they had each developed habits of independence that did not dissolve because of a dress and a yard ceremony in April. There were evenings when she needed the room above the stable, and she used it, and he understood this without requiring explanation. There were mornings when he needed to make a ranch decision before he'd had the chance to consult her, and she arrived afterward to find it made, and they discussed it sometimes easily, sometimes not. The not easy version happened once in July over a supply decision he'd made that affected her kitchen budget without asking. And it was a real argument, kind with raised voices, and 2 people who were both right about different parts of the same problem. And it ended's windows were dark, and it ended not with resolution, but with them both going away for an hour and coming with the parts of the argument that were actually load-bearing versus the parts that were just temper. She had never been able to do that with Thomas. Not because Thomas was wrong, but because Thomas agreed with her too readily, and she had learned young to mistake agreement for understanding, and it had taken her until now to know the difference. After the argument, Silas said in the even voice he used when he had been thinking carefully, "I should have asked first. I know the kitchen budget is yours to manage." "You should have," she said, "and I should have said what I actually meant earlier instead of arguing around it." "What did you actually mean?" "That I don't want to be managed," she said, even helpfully. "I want to be consulted, I know that," he said. "I forgot in the moment." "Then remember in the next moment," she said. He did. That was the thing about Silas he learned. Not effortlessly, not without friction, but he learned and applied what he'd learned, which was not a common quality, and she did not take it for granted. September brought the second phase of construction to completion. 12 days past Silas's optimistic estimate, and 3 days inside the realistic one. The dining room addition had a proper floor, 3 long tables with benches, 2 windows that let in the afternoon light from the south and a back door that connected directly to the expanded kitchen. The cold storage room was attached to the north side of the kitchen, insulated with the particular method Beatrice had read about in a supply catalog and had argued for over Silas's initial skepticism, and which worked exactly as described, keeping things cold through the September heat in a way that the previous creek-dependent arrangement had never managed. She stood in the empty dining room on the evening the construction was finished and looked at it. It was not beautiful. It was functional and solid, and a little raw, the wood still pale from milling, the windows without curtains, the tables plain plank, without any finish yet. It smelled of sawdust and new wood, which she found she liked. Ruth appeared in the doorway behind her. "Well?" Ruth said. "Well," Beatrice agreed. "I've worked in hotel dining rooms for 34 years, Ruth said, looking at the space with the critical eye of a professional evaluating a tool. "This isn't fancy." "No, but it's solid." Ruth said. Good light, good flow between the kitchen and the floor. She was quiet for a moment. I've worked in fancy places that didn't have good flow. It makes everything harder. She looked at Beatrice. When are we opening spring? Beatrice said. After the harvest fair. Ruth nodded. Then we have time to do it right. That's the plan, Beatrice said. She stood in the room a little longer, after Ruth went back to the kitchen. She thought about what it had taken to get here. Not just the money and the construction and the permits, but the 8 months of cooking and recording and fighting and learning and being afraid and doing it anyway. She thought about the empty cookshed she had walked into, and the split work table and the grease on the range. She thought about 4 women, each of whom had arrived at a gate or a door because they had heard that there was someone on the other side who would say, "Come in," and mean it. She thought about Pete, who was now walking Ida May home on Saturday evenings with the full knowledge of both their families, and whose bread sharing had been, she had confirmed, exactly what she suspected, less strategic than genuinely wanted. The instinctive gesture of a young man who had learned in a kitchen that the best things are worth giving to the people you want around. She thought about Hank, who had written 4 sentences at a county hearing and meant everyone. She thought about what this room was going to be, not in the abstract, not as an idea in her accounts book, but as an actual place where actual people would sit and be fed and feel, even for the length of a meal, that somebody had considered whether they were hungry. She turned off the lamp and went back to the kitchen. There was still supper to get on. The Hollowell and Braddock dining house opened the first Saturday of the following May, which was 11 days after the second harvest fair, since Beatrice had arrived in Copper Ridge with a wagon full of bread and $1.40. She had planned to wait until after the fair. Then she had changed her mind, for reasons she didn't fully articulate to anyone, including herself, until the morning of the fair, when she was loading the wagon at 4 in the morning, with Ruth beside her, and Nora organizing the accounting box, and Clara and Ida May carrying crates in the particular, efficient relay system they had developed over the winter. She had changed her mind because the fair came first. The fair always came first. The fair was where this had started, and she wanted the dining house opening to come after the fair the way the second act of a life comes, after you've finally finished the first one. You're going back, Silas said, watching her load. It was not a question. I want to see it from the other side, she said. What it looks like now. I'll come with you, he said. She shook her head. Come later. Come when the market is busy. I want to set up alone. He understood this, which was one of the things she continued to find remarkable about Silas Braddock, his capacity to understand things she had not fully explained, which was not the same as Thomas's habit of agreeing with things before she'd finished saying them. This was different. This was a man who had been paying attention for a year and had learned something from it. The drive to Copper Ridge was different in May than it had been in August. The land was green in a tentative way, the particular green of a season that has not committed yet, and the road was dry but not dusty, and she drove with the window of her attention open in a way she had kept closed for most of the previous 3 years. She arrived at the fairgrounds at 6:30. Purcell was already there, the nervous fair organizer. Stiville were dark, still looking as if he expected disaster from whatever direction he wasn't currently watching. And when he saw her wagon, he came forward with the particular expression of a man who is revising his assumptions in real time. He stopped. Mrs. Braddock, I have you down for a table this year. I put you near the entrance. She looked at him. Thank you, she said, but I'd like the table at the end of the row. He blinked. That's the worst position on the grounds. I know where it is, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has decided that trying to understand some decisions is not within his remit, and then he pointed toward the south end of the grounds and went back to his clipboard. She sat up alone the way she'd asked. The table at the end of the row was exactly as she remembered. It backed against the fence. The cattle must when the wind shifted the distance from the entrance long enough that most of the fair traffic would pass other tables first. The ground was the same, since the fence was the same. The particular angle of early morning light coming over the tops of the stalls was the same. She unloaded the wagon methodically, 12 loaves of bread, 4 dozen rolls, 6 pies, 2 apple, 1 cherry, 1 peach, and 2 she had added this year, a honey walnut, and a late-season rhubarb because she had learned rhubarb from Ruth over the winter and had been waiting for a proper occasion to put it in front of strangers. She arranged the table with the same attention she always gave it, the small, deliberate choices that amounted, over decades, to a kind of signature. Then she stood behind the table and waited. The fair opened at 8. At 7:55, a woman arrived. Not a customer, or not yet. A woman in her mid-40s, wearing a good coat for the season, who walked directly to the end of the row with the purposeful stride of someone who knows where she is going and why. She stopped to Beatrice's table and looked at the bread and the pies, and then at Beatrice with an expression that was not the pity or the gossip or the polite indifference Beatrice had received from this fair the last time. "I was at the hearing in October," the woman said. "I've been wanting to come to the ranch to eat, but I kept putting it off. I don't know why." She paused. "I wanted to tell you that what you said about a man deciding you should fail. I've thought about that every month since you said it." Beatrice looked at her. "I'm glad," she said, simply. "How much for the rhubarb?" the woman said. 30 cents, Beatrice said. The woman bought the rhubarb pie and a loaf of bread and walked back into the fair, and Beatrice watched her go and thought, this is what it looks like now. The fair opened and the customers came. Not in a rush, not the sudden dramatic reversal that stories sometimes manufacture for the sake of a clean moment. They came steadily, consistently, the way water rises rather than crashes. Families who had walked past last August stopped this year. Some of them recognized her from the hearing, some from the ranch's growing reputation, some simply because the table at the end of the row had a line forming at it, and a line at the end of the row was sufficiently unusual to attract the curiosity that lines always attract. Clara was beside her, and Nora, and Ruth, who had her own presence behind a table, the particular authority of a woman who has been a professional for 34 years and doesn't need anyone to confirm it. And Ida May, who was selling rolls with the straightforward confidence of a 17-year-old who has spent a year being taught by people who are serious about their work and has absorbed enough of it to carry herself accordingly. Beatrice moved between the table and the wagon, restocking, managing the flow, answering questions about the dining house with the information she and Nora had printed on a small card, Hollowell and Braddock Dining House, Braddock Ranch, opening this spring. Meals served daily. 3 people asked about employment. She took their names and told them to come to the ranch the following Thursday. At 11 o'clock, young Pete arrived, having driven the supply wagon in the ranch with 2 additional crates she'd left behind as backup, and having apparently also brought Hank and 2 other cowboys who were off duty and who positioned themselves near the table with the slightly excessive protectiveness of men who have decided that attending a market fair is a legitimate use of their Saturday and are not interested in being questioned about it. Hank bought a honey walnut pie without comment and ate a quarter of it standing at the edge of the fairgrounds with the same unself-conscious appetite he'd applied to the cinnamon rolls in the bunkhouse 8 months ago. When he finished, he folded the paper she'd wrapped it in and put it in his coat pocket, which was such a particular and uncharacteristic gesture that she noticed it and then looked away before he could catch her noticing. She was in the middle of wrapping bread for a family of 4, a mother and 3 children, the youngest of whom was holding his roll with both hands and eating it with a focused intensity that she recognized as the eating style of a child who has been hungry and hasn't entirely forgotten it when she saw him coming through the crowd. Silas, moving the way he moved in crowds not pushing through, but present enough that people adjusted around him without quite registering why. He was later than she expected, which meant he had given her the morning alone the way she'd asked, and had waited until the fair was fully running before he came, which was, she reflected, exactly the right reading of what she'd wanted without her having specified it. He reached the table and looked at what was left, which was considerably less than she'd started with, and looked at the 4 women and at Pete and Hank and the small crowd still gathered, and then he looked at her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He bought the last cinnamon roll not dramatically, not as a callback to anything, just because it was there, and he wanted it and ate it beside the table while she served the last few customers. And when the windows were dark, and when the table was nearly empty and the line had thinned, she stepped back from it for the first time all morning and stood beside him, and looked at the fairgrounds. She could see the spot near the entrance where the best tables were. She could see the organized center of the market, the visible commerce of it, the place where foot traffic was densest and attention was most easily captured. She could see from the far end of the row the entire geography of a market that had once arranged itself without reference to her existence. She looked at it from where she was standing and thought about what it had cost her to be here, in this specific place, with these specific people, the accounts book full, and the dining house opening in 2 weeks, and the county hearing behind her and Orson Vale somewhere in this fair today, because he was always at the fair. It was part of his territory management and all the rest of it. Kitchen, the sourdough crock, Pete's 4 drafts, Ruth's 34 years, Clara's still hands on a cold morning, Ida May at 5 o'clock every morning, sharp, Thomas, who had believed in her before she'd earned it, her mother, whose hand she could still feel over hers, on bread dough at 5 in the morning when she was 7 years old. And something she had been turning over for a year, something she'd said in a courthouse to a room full of people and had believed at the time, and now, standing at the end of the row with the last of her bread sold, and her name on a dining house, and her husband eating a cinnamon roll beside her, believed with a different quality, the way you believe something you've tested, rather than something you've declared. The crowd did not give her value the day they came to her table. Silas had not created her strength when he stopped to buy a roll. The hearing had not transformed her into someone worth defending. She had always been worth it. That was the thing she had been working toward. The understanding that had been building since August, since the wagon road north, since the cook shed and the split work table and the first empty pot. Not that she had become worthy, she had always been worthy. The question had windows were dark. The question had never been about her worth. The question had been about whether she was to stop allowing other people to adjudicate it. Orson Vale had walked past her table last August and said some women never learn when they've already lost, and she had thought in that moment that he was talking about her bakery. He wasn't. He was talking about her, about the particular diminishment that is easier to perform when the person in front of you has already accepted it as their correct size. She had spent 3 years accepting it. She was done. Silas finished the cinnamon roll and folded the paper and put it in his pocket, the same gesture as Hank, which she noticed with a particular warmth, and he looked at her with the expression she had learned over a year, the one that was both question and statement, depending on which direction you were coming from. Took his hand. Not for long. A moment, the particular grip of 2 people who have earned the ease of it. Most of its windows were dark, and then she released it because there were customers still approaching, and Clara needed direction, and Nora's accounting box needed the last receipts entered before they packed up. But for that moment, she held his hand in the summer heat at the end of the row where she had once stood with $1.40 and the specific fear of a woman who had been told, in so many ways and for so long, that the space she occupied was too much. She had stopped believing that. It had not been a single moment of transformation. It had been bread dough at 4 in the morning. It had been a split work table scrubbed to clean wood. It had been 12 men who went to a courthouse with written statements because someone had learned how they liked their eggs. It had been Clara's hands learning to be still in a different way. Nora's ledger full of numbers that told the truth. Ruth teaching without being asked. Ida May arriving at 5 o'clock every morning because she had decided this was her direction and she was going to it. It had been every single thing she had built in the months between that August and this one. And it had been one man stopping at a table that everyone else walked past. Not to rescue her, not to fix what was broken, but simply to taste something and say, that is the finest thing I have eaten in years. And to mean it. And to want to know who taught her. Her mother. 30 years of practice. And everything she had become in the 3 years after she stopped waiting for the world to recognize what she already was. She turned back to the table. The Hollowell and Braddock dining house opened 14 days later, on a Tuesday morning in late May, and the dining room that smelled of new wood in September smelled, by opening day, of bread and coffee, and the particular accumulated warmth of a kitchen that has been working for months. Most of its windows were dark. Beatrice had hung 2 curtains in the dining room windows, plain cotton, dark blue as her wedding dress because she had fabric left over, and it seemed right to connect the things. Tables filled within the first hour. Not every seat. She was not going to describe that first day as something it wasn't, which was a managed chaos involving one over-communication about the pie schedule that set Ruth and Nora at brief cross-purposes, and a situation with a five that required Ida May to improvise a children's portion she hadn't prepared for. And handle it with a competence that made Beatrice set down what she was doing and watch for 10 seconds before picking it back up again. But the tables filled. Travelers and locals, and 3 women from the far end of the county who had heard through a chain of people that this was a place that hired women, and who arrived not as customers but as possibilities, and whom Beatrice sat down with on the following Thursday and talked to plainly about what she was building, and what it required and what it would give them, which was wages, training, and the particular experience of being taken seriously in a professional kitchen by someone who did not consider their motion a qualification concern. 2 of the 3 came back the following Monday. Vale's dining room in Copper Ridge was still operating. It would continue to operate for another 2 years. When the hired cook left for a better position in the city, and the replacement Vale found was not as good, and the gap between what Vale's dining room offered and what Hollowell and Braddock offered that became visible enough that even the customers who had preferred the novelty of the main street location began making the 12-mile trip north. But that was later. That was a different accounting. What Beatrice knew in May, in the first weeks of the dining house, was that she had built something that was functioning the way she had imagined it would function, not perfectly, not smoothly, not without the daily small disasters that any working kitchen produces, but in the way that a well-made thing functions when it has been put together by people who understood what they were making. The evening of the 3rd week, after the dining room had been cleaned, and the kitchen set up for the morning, and the last of the women had gone home, Beatrice sat at the work table with her accounts book and her coffee, and she went through the week's numbers. They were good, not dramatic. Good in the way that honest work produces good numbers, steady, consistent, slightly better than the week before, with clear indicators of where improvement was possible and clear evidence that the core of what they was doing was sound. She closed the book. She sat for a moment in the kitchen that had started as a filthy cook shed with a grease-coated range and a split work table and a cracked window covered with burlap, and she thought about all the mornings she had been here at 4 o'clock with the lamp on, and the bread dough rising, and the ranch dark and quiet outside. She thought about the accounts book's first page, the careful numbers she had started keeping the night she heard voices through the wall and understood that the machinery had found her again. She thought about the last page, which was this week, which was good. She was not finished. She knew that. There would be more trouble Vale's next angle or someone else's, the difficulties of growth, the particular human complications that arise in any enterprise that involves more than one person with opinions. Ida May's father had not fully reconciled himself to his daughter's professional life, and Pete's grandmother, who lived with his family, had apparently made several remarks about the quality of a young man who spent his free Saturdays at a market fair carrying crates for a widow, which description of Beatrice was 11 months out of date. But she had decided not to address it directly and to let Pete handle it in his own time. Ruth's knees were beginning to give her trouble in cold weather, which she had mentioned, and not again, but which Beatrice had noted and was thinking about in terms of how the kitchen schedule might need to adjust over the coming winter. Clara had started teaching a basic bread lesson to 2 of the new women on Thursday mornings, without being asked, simply because she had learned enough and had seen enough of what teaching did for a person to recognize the value in passing it forward. This was if its windows were dark. This was the thing Beatrice had hoped for and had not known how to engineer the organic replication of the thing she had built. Extending outward through the people she had taught, most of its windows were dark not because she had created a system for it, but because the environment made it the natural behavior of people who had been treated as worth something. You couldn't force that. You could only build the conditions that made it possible and then get out of the way. Silas came in at 9, the way he had been doing for months, and poured himself the last of the coffee and leaned against the wall. "How are the numbers?" he said. "Good," she said. "Better than last week?" "Slightly." He nodded. He drank his coffee. "Ruth's knees," he said after a moment. She looked at him. "How did you know about that?" "Chester told me." Chester knows everything about this ranch before I do. I've stopped being surprised. I'm thinking about the winter schedule, she said. I was thinking, Silas said, that the stool at the bread station is too low. If we raised it by 2 inches, she wouldn't have to bend as far at the work table. She looked at him. I measured the distance yesterday when no one was in the kitchen, he said with the mild tone of a man who has considered this practical and does not understand why she's looking at him the way she's looking at him. She thought about what it was to have someone who paid that kind of attention, who measured a stool height to spare a woman's knees, who bought everything on a table to spare a widow's pride, who drove 12 miles in October to sit beside her in a hearing room he didn't have to attend and stood against the wall after and didn't say anything because he understood that some moments don't need words. 2 inches should do it, she said. I'll tell Chester to have it done by Monday, he said. She nodded and looked back at her accounts book. Outside, the May night was warm enough to have the door open, and the sounds of the ranch came in through it, the cattle, the particular settling sounds of buildings at rest. Somewhere, the faint voice of one of the young hands saying something and another laughing at it. Life, in the specific unorchestrated way of an actual place where actual people did actual work and were fed and paid attention to, and occasionally valued in ways they had not expected. She had not fixed anything. She had not solved anything permanently. She had not arrived at a condition of security that was proof against everything that comes after. What she had done was build a table, a big one with room at it for people who had been told the room didn't exist. A table where Ruth's 34 years were worth the same as Ida May's first year because both of them were real. A table where Clara's still hands had learned to move again, and Nora's ledger told a story that was true, and Pete's four drafts had earned their place in a county record, and Hank's 4 sentences had meant more than most. Speeches she had heard in rooms designed for speeches. A table that started as a split work table in a filthy cook, shed 12 miles north of a market fair where nobody stopped, and that had become, through the daily unspectacular work of people who refused to be less than they were, something that the county of Copper Ridge would not easily forget. Closed the accounts book. She picked up her coffee cup and looked at the man leaning against the wall of her kitchen. In the position he'd taken the first morning he came in for coffee and had never quite left. "Come here," she said. He pushed off the wall and came to where she was sitting, and she stood, and they were in the kitchen the way they had been in the kitchen hundreds of times, with the lamp burning and the night outside and the sourdough crock on the shelf breathing quietly, and she thought, this is what I chose. All of it. Every hard part. She had not been wrong. The accounts book sat on the shelf beside the sourdough crock, and both of them were still going, and in the morning she would be up at 4, and the bread would need making, and the women would arrive, and the dining room tables would fill, and the numbers would be written in Nora's careful hand, and it would be, like all the days that had come before it, both ordinary and entirely worth it. She turned off the lamp. Her name was Beatrice Hollowell Braddock, and she had built something that was hers, and it was enough, and she was more than enough, and she had always been, and she knew it now in a way that did not require anyone's confirmation to remain true. That was the whole of it. That was enough.